Stannis Baratheon stood at the edge of his command tent, peering through a narrow gap in the canvas as the wind roared across the snowy plain. It was late afternoon, but the pale sun had already surrendered to the darkening sky. Frost clung to the edges of his beard, and the stinging cold was so vicious it felt like shards of glass against any bare skin. His gloved hands tightened on the flap. He stared out toward the distant walls of Winterfell, where the Boltons waited. There had been a time, a few short weeks ago, when his faith in Melisandre's visions felt unassailable, when his determination to claim the Iron Throne in the name of justice had driven him to the brink of madness. He had nearly done something unthinkable, an act he could never reverse. But now Shireen was alive, and with that one decision, everything had changed. He remembered the morning he had been brought the news of the storms. The supply lines were choked off. The barrels of bread and dried meats had begun to empty. Horses had fallen dead in the blizzards. Melisandre had insisted on a sacrifice, had reminded him of the power that the Lord of Light could unleash if only he offered king's blood. Shireen carried that blood in her veins. It was an argument she had made again and again, in softer or harsher words, but Stannis had resisted, though only by the narrowest margin of his honor. He had almost given in. He had stood before his daughter's tent, listened to her small, muffled cough in the cold, and told himself it was duty. The realm was at stake. The war demanded every price. Yet some final remnant of paternal love had stayed his hand. The memory still haunted him. How his soldiers had led Shireen out to the pyre, her tearful eyes searching for him, confused but obedient in her father's presence. The child so trusting. He saw the torch in Melisandre's hand, heard the flutter of his banner snapping in the icy wind, the flaming heart overshadowing the stag. But in that agonizing moment, he had wrenched the torch out of Melisandre's grasp. He had thrown it into the snow, extinguishing the dreadful flame with a hiss. The Red Woman's eyes had flared with shock, then fury, and she had insisted he was dooming them all. But he had roared at his men to cut Shireen free. At once, they had, and his daughter had collapsed into his arms, sobbing. In the following days, the wind howled as loudly as ever. The cold sank deeper than before, but something miraculous happened. House Serwyn, long intimidated by the Bolton hold on Winterfell, sent a messenger. They had heard whispers that Stannis had refused to burn his daughter, that he had placed his child above any dark, foreign god. The Serwyn men admired such resolve. They had known lords who would kill for less, men who had chosen power over kin. But to defy the Red Priestess, to save Shireen from that grim fate, some among the North found it a sign. They were a harsh people, battered by endless winters, but they had a fierce sense of loyalty to blood and family. Rumor spread among the smaller houses near the Dreadfort, near Winterfell, and along the White Knife. A man who would not kill his own for advantage might be a man the North could trust. That trust was more valuable than any dark ritual or any promise of magical victory. Stannis could feel it when his own men mustered on the icy morning drills, when they spied new arrivals cresting the horizon. Small companies of northern riders trickling in to pledge their swords. Not an overwhelming flood, and not always official. Sometimes it was only a half-dozen men from House Locke, or a handful of free riders from House Hornwood, but they came bearing quiet words of support. There was talk among the ranks that perhaps the storms might break on their own. The North had known adversity for centuries, and still it stood. Perhaps R'hllor, the Lord of Light, had withheld the sun for his own reasons that had little to do with Shireen. Perhaps faith in steel and loyalty would serve them better than a father's darkest betrayal. Still, the bitterness between Stannis and Melisandre smoldered. The Red Woman rarely let him forget her displeasure. They argued in whispers, for he refused to shame her publicly. But once, she spoke too loudly outside his tent, and passing soldiers heard her admonitions. She insisted the storms were a sign of the Lord's wrath, that only a sacrifice of royal blood could part the swirling snow. But Stannis ordered her to hold her tongue. To press him too far was treason of the spirit, and though he had come to rely on her counsel and her magic, he would never allow her to overshadow him again. Not where Shireen was concerned. This morning, Davos Seaworth stood by Stannis' side, as loyal as ever, and watched the arrival of another group of northern men. A banner fluttered in the snow, a black bear. House Mormont, exiled from Bear Island by the Ironborn but fiercely devoted to the Stark cause. Stannis recalled how their lady, young but fierce, had written him not long ago, insisting there was only one king in the north, and his name was Stark. Yet here they were, these men from Bear Island. They approached with caution but also respect, for if rumors were to be believed, the Boltons had begun to show their cruelty again. Skinned corpses found near the castle, vassals flayed as an example. The new warden of the north was no better than his father, and after Shireen's rescue from the stake, the Mormont men had apparently decided Stannis might be a lesser evil, perhaps even a righteous man. Stannis had endured many humiliations in his life, standing overshadowed by his elder brother, overshadowed even by the memory of his parents who had perished when Storm's End was battered by that fury of wind and waves so many years before. He had knelt to Robert, served dutifully, never with the love that men gave to the charismatic king, but with the loyalty that duty demanded. It had always been enough, until his brother's death, until Joffrey had ascended the throne under the Lannister banner. Then his duty had demanded war, and he had always known war demanded sacrifice. But in saving Shireen, he had discovered something deeper than ambition. He had discovered that if he lost himself entirely, if he let the fires of fanaticism burn away all that made him Stannis of House Baratheon, then the Iron Throne would be meaningless. It would be a hollow seat no matter how glorious. He heard the steady crunch of boots on snow as Davos approached. The Hand of the King, Stannis had named him that, though many lords still mocked the one-time smuggler with missing fingertips, tilted his head in respect. "They've arrived, Your Grace," Davos said. "Perhaps 20 men. Not much in the way of swords, but they bring heart. And they bring news from the west." "What is their news?" Stannis asked, letting the canvas fall shut again, plunging the tent into a dimness lit only by a brazier's dying coals. Davos cleared his throat. "They say that the Boltons are quarreling among themselves. Roose Bolton is cunning, but his bastard son, pardon, Ramsay Bolton now, I suppose, has stirred up fear and hatred. Lord Wyman Manderley at White Harbor might be more open to treat with us than we thought." "That would be a boon indeed." Stannis nodded grimly. "Manderley is fat with pride and with men. But if we gain him, that is a foothold in the east. And how do I hold Shireen safe if we remain in this wasteland? My men are freezing. Our supplies dwindle. No matter how many small houses trickle in, the Boltons still hold Winterfell." Davos shifted, gazing down at the coals. "We must press forward soon, Your Grace, or retreat. A siege in this weather. It's the slow kiss of death." It was the truth, and Stannis knew it. He had marched from Castle Black, leaving behind the free folk that Jon Snow had let pass the wall. Stannis had felt unstoppable then, trusting the Red Woman's visions, trusting in a destiny that seemed so close. But the reality of the North was merciless. The storms had bled his army dry, battered them, forced them into desperation. It was only rumor of houses rebelling against the Boltons that had kept him from turning back. Now, ironically, the choice to spare his daughter had won him fresh respect among the Northmen. Maybe enough respect to tilt the scales. But it would mean an assault on Winterfell in the dead of winter, before supplies ran out entirely. Stannis inhaled, feeling the cold burn his lungs. "We press on," he said at length. "Send for the Mormont men. I will speak with their commander personally." That evening, as the tempest roared anew, Stannis met with the Mormont delegation in his tent. A broad-shouldered man in a ragged cloak introduced himself as Tormund, cousin to the late Jeor Mormont. His thick beard was frosted with ice, his knuckles calloused from years of sword and oar. He told the king tales of Bear Island's ravages, of how the Ironborn had forced the Mormonts from their land, only for them to return in cunning strikes, harrying the invaders. He eyed Stannis's pinched expression, the worn lines in the king's face, and gave a curt nod. "We're no friends to the Boltons," Tormund said in a voice like grinding stones. "Lady Meage is gone, rumored dead fighting in the south. Lady Alisane's been guarding the island, but we have some men on the mainland, scattered. We can't stand alone, not with the flayed man perched in Winterfell. But it said you spared your child from the Red God's flames. He glanced sideways at Melisandre, who lingered by the brazier, silent and watchful. We've heard rumors, dark rumors. Stannis kept his tone measured, though anger threatened to rise. Rumors are often half-truths. But yes, the thought crossed my mind. Melisandre believes in the power of king's blood to awaken the Red God. Yet I will not sacrifice my daughter. Tormund's dark eyes flicked to the Red Woman again. And if that means your cause fails? It will not, Stannis said flatly. I have steel, I have men, and I have the rightful claim to the Iron Throne. If I cannot win it by protecting my own, then I do not deserve to be king. There was a flicker in Tormund's expression, some combination of respect and lingering doubt. The North remembers, the man said quietly, and it remembers that Ned Stark never sacrificed children. If you intend to seat yourself as king in the North until young Rickon or Bran can be found, if they still live, some might bend the knee if you show the same honor. Stannis frowned, hearing the name of the Stark boys. He had gleaned from Jon Snow that the younger Stark children might yet be alive, though scattered. Meanwhile, Sansa was rumored to be in the clutches of the Boltons. The North yearned for the return of the Starks, but until that day, someone had to stand against the flayed man. I will do what I must, Stannis said. But the Boltons will not hold the Stark seat so long as I draw breath. If your people wish to fight, stand with me, and I will not betray that trust. I swear it on my life. Tormund dipped his head. I'll pass the word. For now, we're at your command. We'd rather freeze here than kneel to the bastard of Bolton. Melisandre parted her lips, as if to speak, but Stannis cut her off. Thank you, he said to Tormund. Return to your men and rest. We march on Winterfell soon. Our scouts will confirm the roads. As Tormund left, Melisandre stepped forward, her crimson robes rippling in the flickering light of the brazier. You risk a great deal, she said in a quiet voice, pitched only for Stannis. These Northerners test your resolve. They are watchers of old gods, and they fear my Lord of Light. How can we prevail without his blessing? Stannis's gaze was stern, though a trace of regret hid in the corners of his eyes. You promised me victory at the Blackwater if I offered up blood. I gave you Gendry's blood in leeches, yet we lost that battle. You claimed the War of Five Kings would tilt in my favor if I followed the flames, but we have known setback after setback. I near froze on my march to the wall. I lost men, many men, good men, along the King's Road. His voice grew more bitter. You told me the cold and darkness were illusions, that the Lord of Light would guide us. Yet here we stand, half-starved, at the foot of Winterfell. Melisandre did not flinch. You have not given your all, Stannis Baratheon. You have not surrendered your final offering. Your daughter. He raised a hand. Speak no more of Shireen. I have made my decision. You are my advisor, not my master. Pray if you must. Lawler may favor us still or not, but we will take Winterfell by steel and strategy if the gods refuse to help. The Red Woman's eyes glowed like embers, but she lowered them, grudgingly acquiescing. As you command, your grace. The days that followed were a blur of preparations. Stannis had his men gather what was left of the horses, feed them with the last reserves of oats, and ready them for a final push. He summoned the Sellswords who still served him, grim-faced men whose loyalty was measured in gold, and promised them double shares if they fought bravely at the gates. He huddled with his commanders, hammered out the plan of attack. Winterfell's walls were high, but the castle was large, and the snows might lend cover. They would strike near dawn, perhaps, or in the dead of night. The Mormonts would lead a small flank from the north. House Serwyn would come from the south. If the rumors were true, the Boltons had outraged too many lords. They might find themselves fighting on two fronts if certain houses rose up in the moment of chaos. All the while, Stannis kept Shireen close in the camps, well guarded. He could see the way his daughter looked at him, her eyes big, uncertain, the scar of grayscale on her cheek a dark blotch in the flickering campfire light. She knew what had nearly happened, though she had not dared to speak of it. She loved him still, but a wariness had settled over her. In her young voice he sometimes heard a tremor. On the eve of the march, he found her reading in a corner of his tent, a fur thrown around her shoulders. Her lips were slightly blue from the cold. He approached, kneeling at her side, and placed a hand on her head, feeling how chilled her hair was. She looked up, startled, then offered a small smile. "Father," she said, her breath pluming. He nodded. "What are you reading?" "Stories of the Targaryen dragons," she replied. "Of Aegon and Rhaenys and Visenya. It's better than thinking about the fighting." Stannis gently lifted the old tome from her lap. "War is terrible," he said. "I never wanted you to see any of this. You should be safe in a warm castle." She averted her eyes. "I know you almost—" Her voice faltered, then steadied. "I'm grateful you changed your mind. I prayed to the Seven, though I wasn't sure if they would listen." Stannis's chest tightened. He was not a man given to gentle words. It always felt as if the truth was stuck behind a wall of iron. Yet he forced himself to speak. "I was wrong, or nearly so. You must believe me. I have done many things in the name of duty, Shireen. I have had men executed, I have led armies, and I will do so again. But never doubt that I love you. You are my daughter and the future of my line. I promise you, I will never again consider such madness." Her face brightened, relief washing over her. "Thank you, Father." He tightened his jaw. "Tomorrow we march on Winterfell. You will remain behind the lines. Davos will see to your safety. You've always liked Ser Davos, haven't you?" She nodded, a warm fondness in her eyes. "Yes, he's kind. He brought me stories from Braavos once. Remember?" Stannis recalled the fond memory of the smuggler turned hand bringing puzzle boxes and old folktales to keep the girl occupied. "Aye, he's a good man. You are not to be near the fighting. You'll stay guarded until we have victory, or until I return." Shireen hesitated, then said softly, "But what if you don't return?" Stannis fought the urge to laugh bitterly. Children were often more perceptive than adults gave them credit for. "Then you must be strong. The Baratheon name must carry on, and Ser Davos will keep you safe, along with the men who still believe in me. But I intend to see you in the great hall of Winterfell, where you will warm yourself by the hearth." The next morning broke in a swirl of gray light and stinging snow. Melisandre stood apart, her head bowed as she chanted in a low voice, her breath curling like smoke. She had placed a fire on a small mound, letting it hiss and crackle, as if to challenge the swirling flakes around it. Some men muttered that it was a wasted effort. Others stood entranced by her presence. But the soldiers primarily readied themselves, fastening cloaks, adjusting saddles, triple-checking the edges of their swords and axes. They had been battered and tested by the cold, but the knowledge of a promised battle lent new vigor. They would rather die fighting than freeze to death in the wilderness. Stannis rode among them, though half of the horses were too weak for a gallop. He wore a black cloak lined with fur, pulled tight, and a broad-brimmed helm that concealed most of his gaunt features. He gave them few words of inspiration. He was not Robert, to raise men's spirits with a roar and a grin. Instead, he told them in his clipped voice that their enemy was near, that victory meant warmth and shelter. They could claim the bastion of Winterfell as their own. The men responded with grim determination. They were done with waiting. Davos led a small vanguard, forging a path through the drifts. A host of 50 men marched behind him, followed by a second wave of another 70. Mormont men advanced on the left flank, bearing their Black Bear banner. Serwyn men on the right, with their Flaidlim banner forcibly torn and burned, replaced with only the sigil of the twin battle-axes. They had no love left for the Boltons, who had skinned a Serwyn boy in punishment for tardy tribute. Now those men marched with a thirst for vengeance. In total, Stannis had perhaps 500 men still able to fight, supplemented by the newly joined Northerners. Against the Boltons' rumored thousands, it seemed dire. But if other northern lords rose up at the last moment, if the news of Stannis' honor spread further, perhaps the balance would shift. The snow muffled their approach, swallowing the sound of boots and hooves alike. The sky was a vast white void. Winterfell's towers appeared out of the haze, dark shapes looming. The spiked crenellations were frosted with rime, the moat an icy trench. Stannis eyed the familiar fortress. He had spent little time here in life, but its significance was seared into every corner of Westeros. Winterfell was the seat of House Stark, an ancient line older than the Targaryens, older than the stories of the Undul invasion. And now it was in the clutches of traitors. A bolt whistled from the battlements, burying itself in the snow. The cry went up. The Bolton guards had spotted them. Horns echoed across the plain. Soldiers and archers began to line the ramparts, though it was hard to see their numbers through the swirling flurries. Stannis raised his sword, Old Lightbringer, though it no longer glowed as fiercely as legend claimed. He had sometimes wondered if its flame had dimmed in reflection of his own failing faith. It didn't matter. Steel was steel. He bellowed the order to charge. They advanced in a wedge, the front line carrying heavy shields. Archers behind them tried to loose arrows, but the swirling snow made aim difficult. Now and again, a Bolton arrow found its mark, and a man would tumble, crying out, but they pressed on. The battered gate of Winterfell awaited, battered from centuries of reinforcement, but it was stout and formidable. If they were forced into a long siege, it might be hopeless. So the plan demanded a swifter approach. On the northern side, Mormont men launched a diversionary assault. They hurled grappling hooks at the walls, tried to climb the slippery stone. The Bolton archers rushed to that flank to repel them. Meanwhile, Davos and the main host thundered toward the gate. The sellswords, brave for coin, carried a ram, a great battering trunk. The gate shuddered under its first impact. One man took a crossbow bolt to the throat and fell gurgling into the snow, but another took his place. Crash, crash. The heavy ram pummeled the wood, sending echoes through the courtyard beyond. A shrill shout rose from behind the walls. The gates parted slightly, and the Bolton cavalry surged out, aiming to scatter Stannis' infantry. On swift horses clad in thick leathers, the Bolton riders wore the flayed man on their shields. At their head was a sneering knight in dark armor. Men roared on both sides as the cavalry clashed with the front line. Stannis spurred his own horse forward, brandishing Lightbringer. The beast was near starved, but it responded to his iron will, galloping headlong into the fray. They collided, steel ringing on steel, swords hacking through flesh. The swirl of snow turned pink with blood. The Bolton riders were outnumbered on open ground, but they had the advantage of speed. Stannis' men had to hold firm. Davos, grim-faced, shoved a soldier aside in time to parry a lance thrust. The man on the horse fell, pierced by Davos's return strike. Another Bolton knight reeled as an arrow from a Serwyn bow found his breastplate's gap. The confusion was thick. The world turned into a chaos of hooves, shouting, and the unstoppable grind of conflict. Stannis roared as he cleaved through a Bolton man's helm, seeing the man topple from the saddle. Snow cushioned the dead, turned red beneath them. On the walls, archers continued to rain arrows. Over the din, a horn suddenly blared. From the southwestern approach came a new force. The gates had opened again, revealing more Bolton men, foot soldiers this time, surging out to encircle the battered left flank. Stannis saw the Mormonts, pinned against the walls, fighting valiantly but threatened from behind. He cursed under his breath. They were being surrounded. If more houses didn't join, if no new allies emerged, the battle might be lost. Then, from beyond a stand of bare weirwood trees, another horn answered. Low, mournful, like a northern wind across a lonely sea. And out of the swirling white, they came, riders wearing a white merman on a pale green field. House Manderly, perhaps 100 strong. Not a massive host, but enough to tilt the balance at a crucial moment. They fell upon the Bolton flank from behind, yelling for the king in the north. Caught by surprise, the Bolton men scattered, or turned to face this new threat. The Mormonts rallied, dealing savage blows with their axes. The battleground devolved into a mess of swirling chaos. Selzwards died side by side with Bolton men. The Manderleys pressed forward. Davos had regained the ram. The gate was battered further, cracking under the relentless pounding. Up on the battlements, watchers shouted confused commands. Stannis glimpsed men in Bolton livery retreating through the courtyard, as though uncertain whether to stand or fall back. They had not expected this many foes. Rumor might have told them Stannis was on his last legs. The truth was more complicated. Finally, with a splintering crack, the gate gave way. The thick beams were shattered. Stannis's men let out a roar and flooded inside, crossing the threshold into Winterfell's courtyard. Archers above let fly, and more men fell, but the momentum was with Stannis now. Once inside, his footmen hammered into the defenders. Pockets of Bolton loyalists clung to corners, forced a savage fight near the stables, or in the alley between the Great Hall and the First Keep. Blood slicked the icy stones. Screams echoed off old walls that had once heard the laughter of Starks at feast. Stannis himself urged his horse across the courtyard, sword raised. He spotted a man in pale armor standing near the steps of the Great Hall, surrounded by a cluster of Bolton soldiers. The man's face was pale and gaunt, with watery eyes and a half-smirk twisted by malice. Ramsay Bolton, the rumored bastard of the Dreadfort. Even through the fury of battle, Stannis could sense the man's cruelty radiating like a stench. Selzwards parted around him, uncertain if they dared face him directly. Ramsay sneered at the king. "So the false king arrives. Where's your Red Witch? Did she abandon you yet?" He licked his lips as if tasting a private joke. "Father says you're a stubborn fool. Perhaps I'll feed you to our dogs once we put you in chains. Or feed your daughter to them. I hear you almost burned her anyway. What's the difference?" A violent rage seized Stannis. He kicked his horse forward with a snarl. Ramsay's men interposed themselves, trying to block the king's charge. Lightbringer came swinging down, splitting a guard's shield in two. Horses screamed. Another Bolton soldier grabbed for Stannis's reins, yanking fiercely, nearly pulling him from the saddle. Stannis lashed out, hacking into the man's arm, freeing himself. He glimpsed Ramsay turning to flee up the steps into the Great Hall, flanked by a pair of guards. Davos seized on the moment, rallying men at the center of the courtyard. The Manderleys had pressed in from the southwestern corner, ridding the walls of Bolton archers. The Mormonts were inside now too, prowling with lethal precision. Shouts of "For the King!" and "Winterfell!" clashed, reverberating through the yard. The Bolton men were losing ground, but they fought viciously, flailing with axes and maces, stalling the invasion with every ounce of cruelty. Bodies littered the ground, red stains creeping over trodden snow. Stannis dismounted. His horse had taken a spear in its flank and was reeling. He let the beast collapse, then stepped over it. He advanced toward the Great Hall, ignoring the biting cold and the stabbing pain in his own leg. Some arrow or splinter had grazed him. He wasn't even sure. All that mattered was finishing this. If Ramsay fled deeper into the castle, or if Roose Bolton regrouped, the fight might turn again. He stormed up the steps, flanked by 3 of his men. Inside the massive wooden doors, the Great Hall was dimly lit by guttering torches. Long tables stretched beneath the banners, mostly flayed men of red and pink. A few stark banners lay crumpled in corners. Ramsay stood near the dais, chest heaving, with a crossbow in hand. Around him, a cluster of Bolton soldiers formed a half-circle of steel. They eyed Stannis warily. "I'll kill you," Ramsay spat, sweat beading on his brow despite the cold. "I'll feed your limbs to my hounds. Stannis did not wait for more threats. He lunged, meeting the first soldier's sword with his own. Lightbringer sang, cutting a quick arc. Sparks flew. Another Bolton man came in from the side, forcing Stannis to pivot. His old skill from the War of the Five Kings served him well. He might not be as young or strong as he once was, but he was precise. He deflected an overhead blow, then slammed the pommel into the man's face. Cartilage cracked, The soldier went down with a shriek. A crossbow bolt whizzed past Stannis' shoulder, so close he felt the wind of it. Ramsay hissed in frustration, fumbling to reload. Stannis pressed forward, only to be caught by another soldier, the man's blade cutting through Stannis' bracer. Pain flared in his forearm. He fought on, punching the man aside. Davos appeared in the hall's entrance with a rush of more troops. They crashed into the Bolton defenders, forcing them back, overwhelming them. Shouts reverberated from the stone walls as men died among the overturned tables and spilled drinks. A brazier clattered to the floor, sending up sparks and smoke. Ramsay let out a cry and tried to run toward a side door, but Tormund Mormont blocked his path with a hefty mace. Ramsay darted back, glancing wildly around for an escape. His crossbow half-loaded, he raised it again only for Davos to hurl a dagger. It sank into Ramsay's left shoulder, causing him to miss his shot. The crossbow's bolt clattered off stone. Stannis marched forward, ignoring the taste of blood in his mouth. He seized Ramsay by the collar, yanking him forward. With a twist, he smashed the bastard's face into the dais' edge, hearing a yelp of pain and fury. The man struggled like a cornered beast, spitting curses, but Stannis had him pinned. "You call yourself a lord?" Stannis growled, voice low and dangerous. "You call this your seat? By all the gods, it belongs to House Stark." Ramsay tried to laugh, the sound distorted by his bloodied mouth. "As if you'd do better. You'd kill your own." Stannis slammed him again, silencing him. Then, in one swift motion, he drew a dagger from his belt. For a moment, he contemplated a final, merciless thrust to end the bastard's life. But the memory of Shireen's tear-stained face flickered in his mind. He was done with monstrous deeds, if he could help it. Instead, he hissed to Davos, "Take him prisoner. Bind him, keep him under guard. He'll answer for his crimes." Davos nodded, signaling 2 men. They grabbed Ramsay's arms, twisting them behind him as the bastard howled. "You'll regret this," Ramsay shrieked. "My father!" A thunderous crash echoed from beyond the hall. Men poured in, breathless, exclaiming that the Boltons were retreating to the inner keep, that Roose Bolton was nowhere to be seen. Some said he had fled. Others claimed he was holed up in the tower. But the courtyard was nearly secured, the men chanting for Stannis to claim the castle. Manderley men had seized control of the gates. Mormont and Cerwyn men roamed in search of scattered Bolton loyalists. Over the din, a new cry began to rise, a cry that Stannis at first barely recognized. "The king in the north!" someone shouted, half laughing. "Stark! Stark!" Another voice, "Baratheon! Baratheon! Long live the king!" It was chaos, but in that chaos Stannis sensed possibility. If Roose Bolton had indeed fled or was captured, Winterfell was practically in his hands. He could restore it to the Starks if any lived to reclaim it. In the meantime, he would hold it in the name of rightful justice, defend it from further tyranny. The men who had stood by him would find shelter, warmth, real food. He looked down at his own battered form, cuts in his armor, blood trickling down his wrist. His left thigh burned with pain, yet he still stood, still breathed. He had won this day, or was close to it, at least. "Send word to all forces," he said to Davos. "Secure the keep. Any Bolton men who lay down arms are to be taken prisoner. Their leaders." He glanced at Ramsay, who glared back with feral hate. "Their leaders shall face judgment." Davos nodded. "And you, your grace? I'll see the gates. See Shireen. She'll want to know we've survived." Despite the swirl of victory, a part of him still felt hollow. He had fought for so long, first for Robert, then against Joffrey, then for his own claim. He had even marched beyond the wall to fight the wildlings, forging alliances. Now he stood in Winterfell, but at what cost? So many men lay dead in the courtyard, their warm blood steaming in the snow. And if word spread that he was the new occupant of Winterfell, would the rest of the North rise to support or to challenge him? It remained uncertain, and the war for the Iron Throne was far from over. But at least Shireen was alive, and that single truth gave him a measure of solace he had scarcely known before. When he emerged into the courtyard, his men cheering, Stannis drew in a sharp breath. Bodies were being cleared, the smoke from torches drifting upward. A portion of the castle had been set aflame, either by a stray brazier or sabotage, but the Mormonts were already dousing it with snow and water from the wells. He watched as soldiers dragged the wounded to a makeshift healing station under the overhang. Some men knelt in prayer, others rummaged for any scrap of food in the storerooms. After this bitter campaign, even a single loaf of stale bread was treasure. In the midst of the bustle, Davos escorted Shireen through the gates, her eyes wide as she beheld the aftermath of battle. She had a cloak drawn tight, and tears welled when she saw her father spattered with blood and grime. She broke into a run, stumbling on the churned snow, and Stannis went to her, ignoring the pain in his leg. She clung to him. For a moment, father and daughter embraced amid the swirling snow and the stench of death. Nothing else existed. "I was so frightened," she whispered against his chest. "I heard the screaming and the horns. I thought you might." "I'm here," Stannis said, breathing raggedly. "I'm here, my sweet girl." Davos stood at a respectful distance, his expression heavy with relief. Around them, the men beheld their king cradling his daughter, and some felt a stirring of admiration, or at least acceptance. If they had once doubted whether Stannis was a cold man capable of monstrous acts, the sight of him now, holding Shireen with raw tenderness, conflicted with that fear. They had all heard the story of how he spared her, but this was proof of the father's love. A king who loved his child enough to defy a sorceress's demands was perhaps a king some men could follow. Over the hours, pockets of Bolton resistance were snuffed out or forced to surrender. Roose Bolton himself was discovered in a hidden passage, trying to escape the castle under cover of night. Wounded by an arrow in the chaos, he was in no condition to fight. He was dragged to the great hall where Stannis kept watch. Ramsay spat curses and threats from his corner, but no one listened. The bastard was manacled to a support beam, watched by 4 heavily armed men who seemed eager to kill him if he so much as flinched wrong. Roose was a different beast. A quiet, pale man with a soft voice that belied his cunning. He stood with a slight stoop, his face nearly expressionless even as he was forced to his knees. Blood stained his tunic. He gazed at Stannis with cold calculation. "You've won a castle," the Lord of the Dreadfort said in a near whisper, "but you'll never hold the North. These lords will turn on you the moment you show weakness." Stannis's voice was flat. "They may. But you and your bastard have lost it. The North will do what it will, but never again under a Bolton's flayed banner." Roose dipped his head, as though conceding the point. "You have no rightful claim, no matter what you think. The Stark line is possibly still alive," Stannis cut in. "Until the rightful Lord of Winterfell steps forward, I will keep it from your grasp. And from here, I press my claim to the Iron Throne. The Boltons are done. If the North rallies to me, so be it. If not, I'll fight for every inch." A flicker of a sneer touched Roose's lips. "Then you'll soon learn how harsh the North can be to outsiders, even those who spare their children." Stannis offered a grim smile. "I've felt the North's harshness, and I remain." He gestured to Davos. "Take him away. A cell for now. We'll see how his fate is decided." Thus ended Bolton rule over Winterfell. Word spread through the region with astonishing speed, carried by fleeing Bolton men and by traveling merchants who had hidden from the battle. The victory was not without cost. Stannis had lost a quarter of his men and some of his most trusted knights, but he had gained the castle, the strategic seat of the North, and the battered hearts of many northern lords who had yearned for someone, anyone, to topple the Boltons. They still remembered the betrayals at the Red Wedding. They remembered how the Boltons had forsaken the Stark name, how they had flayed their enemies, spilled innocent blood. And now rumor abounded that Stannis Baratheon might be a stern man. But he had spared his own child, proving he was not the monster the Boltons were. The next days were spent in frantic repairs, burying the dead, and restoring the castle's halls to some semblance of order. Stannis paced the length of the great hall, deciding whether to tear down the Bolton banners and reinstate the Stark direwolf. He chose the direwolf. House Stark deserved that respect, no matter that the seat was temporarily in his keeping. Melisandre lingered in the Godswood, or in the higher battlements, praying in solitude. Stannis was aware that she had been humiliated. Her prophecy of a sacrifice had been denied, yet they had taken Winterfell regardless. He suspected she would remain with him, convinced that Lawler still had a plan, but her certainty was fractured. She had parted from him with a cryptic whisper. "You have chosen a different path, Stannis Baratheon, but the war for the dawn is not done. We shall see what darkness creeps in the night." He only half listened. For once, he had no taste for her riddles. Meanwhile, the northern houses began sending emissaries. Lord Wyman Manderley arrived in person, with his corpulent figure swathed in furs and a half-dozen knights at his back. He congratulated Stannis on his victory, assured him that White Harbor was open to him should he require ships or trade. Of course, the subject of the Stark heirs arose. Wyman Manderley pressed that if a true Stark was found, Manderley's first loyalty would go there. Stannis merely nodded and said, "As is right." But in the interim, if the White Knife needed a strong protector, would Manderley prefer the Boltons or Stannis? The answer was obvious. Stannis had saved Shireen, and he had not flayed men on the battlements. He had offered a measure of justice that appealed to the North's honor. Other houses were slower to commit, but one by one, lesser lords came forward. They were tired of living in fear of the flayed man. They had not forgotten the Red Wedding. Stannis hammered out alliances, forging uneasy bonds. He promised each house that as soon as a legitimate Stark emerged, he would help restore their seat. But as for now, he needed the North's men to secure the realm against the Lannisters and any other usurpers. Quietly, he also worried about the threat of the others, the undead from beyond the wall, though such talk was too ominous for many to bear. He remembered only too well what Jon Snow had said. Winter was coming indeed. In the weeks that followed, the battered Stormcrow's Sellsword Company left Stannis' service, having claimed their pay. The Mormonts and Serwins remained, as did a portion of his original force from the south. The latter were grateful for the solid walls of Winterfell after the brutality of camping in the open. The battered keep was soon crowded with soldiers, some still limping from wounds, but all were at least sheltered from the worst of the cold. Shireen had a small chamber near the great keep, where she spent much of her time reading or talking with Davos. She occasionally ventured to the Godswood, a place of quiet beauty in the snow, though the face on the weirwood tree unnerved her. She had once asked her father if the old gods would forgive him for the near-sacrifice. Stannis had no answer. Gradually, the land around Winterfell began to stir. Word reached them that the Umbers might rise in support of Stannis, if he would release certain captives. There were rumors that some Karstarks regretted bending the knee to the Boltons. Meanwhile, the question of Ramsay Bolton's punishment hovered in the air. He had tortured and flayed countless souls, Northmen, Ironborn, innocents from the surrounding Islets. Many demanded his head. Some wanted him flayed in return, which Stannis staunchly refused. Not because he pitied the bastard, but because such cruelty was not his way. He had learned a bitter lesson about monstrous acts. He ordered Ramsay to stand trial before a council of northern lords, so all would know justice was done in plain sight. That day, Ramsay raged in his chains, cursing them all, claiming he was the rightful heir to the Dreadfort. He cursed Stannis for not burning Shireen. "You'd have won sooner," he shrieked with mad laughter. "The old gods hate you now." The men in the hall spat on him, calling him a monster and a liar. In the end, the council found him guilty of murder, torture, and treason. They sentenced him to die. Stannis nodded once, and in the presence of dozens, he lopped off Ramsay's head with a single stroke of Lightbringer. The bastard's final expression was twisted madness. Of Roose Bolton, there was no friend to speak on his behalf. He was likewise condemned to death for his treachery at the Red Wedding and for his crimes against the North. He died more quietly than Ramsay, trying to maintain that eerie composure. Stannis had him beheaded as well, though in the presence of northern lords who demanded to witness the end of House Bolton. When it was done, a hush fell over the yard. The flayed man banner was torn down, burned in a brazier. Some men cheered. Others stood silent, heads bowed in memory of the blood spilled. Shireen witnessed none of it. Davos kept her inside. Stannis did not want her to see more death than was necessary. Yet even from within the castle walls, she could sense a tide had turned. Slowly, an uneasy peace settled upon Winterfell. The survivors in the region sent forth cautious messages, acknowledging Stannis's presence. He was an outsider, but he had delivered them from the Boltons. Perhaps that was enough to earn him a reprieve. If the snows relented in the spring, if new supply lines opened, he could rebuild the battered holdfast, and from there maybe press his claim further south. It was a grand ambition, and it might be undone at any moment by new storms, new betrayals. But Stannis Baratheon felt a flicker of something almost like hope. One day, Stannis walked the ramparts with Davos, surveying the crisp white horizon. The wind was sharp, but the skies were clearer than usual. He saw men setting up palisades, reinforcing the outer gates, preparing for the next wave of cold. Some of the Mormonts were hunting in the Wolfswood for game. A few men tried fishing through the ice in the nearby streams. It was a fragile existence, but better than the endless camps on the open road. Davos cleared his throat. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "the North begins to accept you. It is a slow acceptance. They wish for a Stark, but you have given them justice. Perhaps in time that will be enough." Stannis glanced at him, his lined face betraying exhaustion. "I have no illusions that they love me. But love is not necessary, only respect. They see that I spare children, that I will not break guest right or flay men alive. The Boltons' cruelty lost them what loyalty they had." He let out a small snort. "Strange that the refusal to burn my daughter has brought me more friends than any promise of gold or favor. Perhaps fatherhood is a currency of its own, in the North." Davos offered a small smile. "I think they admire you for it. Some of them, anyway. You proved you were not a man to cross that final line. And you proved you can stand against the likes of the Boltons." Stannis rested a hand on the cold stone of the parapet. "I will not pretend it was an easy decision. There was a moment I nearly gave in. A moment I believed the Red Woman's promises over the life of my own child." He shook his head. "That I even considered it shames me. But I've learned that shame can be washed away by actions. Let the North see that I stand by those I would defend. Let the realm see it." They fell silent, the only sound the wind rushing over the walls. In the courtyard below, Shireen emerged with a small retinue, including a pair of Baratheon guards and one Mormont swordswoman. The girl had a timid step on the icy ground. She paused near the remnants of the old Stark crypt entrance, looking at the statues of direwolves carved into the stone. Davos watched her from above, empathy clear in his gaze. "You might consider a feast, Your Grace," Davos said. "A sign of goodwill. The North might not be used to feasting in winter, but it could raise spirits." Stannis grunted in mild agreement. "If we can spare the food, yes. A modest gathering. We must ration carefully. But you are right. Morale is everything." So a few days later, they held a subdued but heartfelt banquet in the great hall. The battered tables were covered with simple fare: stewed turnips, salted pork, some fish from the White Knife, coarse bread. It was far from the feasts of King's Landing or Highgarden, but it was enough to fill bellies and foster a sense of camaraderie. Manderleys, Serwyns, Mormonts, and a smattering of others attended. Talk turned to the cold, the future, and the rumors of White Walkers beyond the wall. Stannis listened gravely, occasionally glancing at Melisandre, who hovered near a corner, her red robes whispering across the floor. She said nothing, but her eyes occasionally flickered with an otherworldly intensity. Shireen sat at the high table, though she ate little. She seemed content to watch, to observe the lords in their cups, to let the swirl of conversation wash over her. Now and then, she whispered a question to Davos. Stannis noticed the Karstark emissaries eyeing her. He wondered if they were thinking, "That is the girl he almost burned," or if they were thinking, "She's the reason we can trust him." Perhaps both. In any case, the feast passed peacefully. That was an achievement in these times of civil war and betrayal. Afterward, in the gloom of the late evening, Shireen approached her father outside the hall. A single torch flickered on the wall, casting shadows across the ancient stones. She held a small scrap of parchment, lined with a few spidery words. "Father," she said timidly, "I've been reading about the Starks, how they used to keep the old gods and how they valued honor above all. I wrote something for them." She held out the parchment. Stannis frowned slightly but accepted it. The writing was a short prayer, an invocation for peace in Winterfell, for a safe return of any missing Stark heirs, for the memory of those who had died. It was simple, heartfelt, the kind of small blessing a child might give. His first instinct was to think it naive, but he caught himself. He had turned from cynicism when he chose Shireen over sacrifice. Perhaps he could honor this small token. "It's good," he said quietly. "The old gods, the new gods, the Lord of Light, they're all listening, maybe. Keep your prayer, Shireen. Perhaps read it at the heart tree." She ventured a smile. "Do you think they'll hear me?" He placed a rough hand on her shoulder. "I think you're worth hearing." In the following weeks, as winter's grip tightened further, the castle settled into an uneasy routine. Scouts reported that the Karstarks were massing, possibly to join Stannis if he recognized their claims. The Umbers had begun skirmishing with stray Bolton loyalists near the last hearth. Meanwhile, White Harbor sent more supplies up the White Knife, though the path was treacherous. The worst threat now seemed to be simple starvation, or the rumored approach of White Walkers. Stannis was no fool. He knew the real war might be up at the wall, against an enemy that cared nothing for iron thrones or rightful claims. He had not forgotten his sense of duty, hammered into him through so many trials. One gray morning, a raven arrived from Castle Black, bearing word from Jon Snow, confirmation that wildlings had begun to settle beyond the wall, that tensions with the Watch were high, and that rumors of strange sightings multiplied. Stannis read the scroll with a grim set to his jaw. He could have marched north again, but that would mean abandoning the north to chaos. And he had only just secured Winterfell. He felt torn by conflicting duties, forced to weigh the living inhabitants of the kingdom against a threat so dire that few believed it. Yet Jon Snow's words rung with sincerity. Davos found Stannis in the solar, the letter before him, his face pale. "Your Grace, is there trouble?" Stannis exhaled a frosty breath. "The worst kind, but I cannot move yet. The Karstarks, the Umbers, even the Manderleys, they're looking to me for leadership. If I march away, all this might unravel." "And what of Shireen?" Davos nodded slowly, sympathy in his eyes. "You must decide soon, though. If the dead truly walk, we can't ignore it." Stannis stared at the flickering candle on his table. "Yes, war creeps upon us from all sides, but let it never be said that I abandoned the north to the Boltons, or that I harmed my own flesh and blood to feed a fire." He rose, his joints stiff. "Bring me Tormund Mormont. We'll ride out to inspect the Wolfswood, see if any outlaws lurk. Our men need training if we're to stand against anything worse." That was how the days passed. Stannis forging alliances with the local houses, sending out patrols, consolidating his hold. He was not crowned king in the north. He did not claim the title, for it was not his birthright. He named himself protector of Winterfell in the absence of the Starks. Some called him the Wolf King, half in jest, half in grudging respect. Others called him the Southern Stag, a mild insult. He did not care. The important thing was that the North was mostly unified against the memory of the Boltons, and that they had a single, solid presence at Winterfell. Even as the snows deepened, they repaired sections of the walls, hammered new gates into place, and reinforced the keep. Fires burned in every hearth, staving off the worst of the cold, but supplies were never plentiful. They rationed carefully, sending out hunters, relying on House Manderley's rare shipments. Through it all, Shireen remained. She became a symbol of a different Stannis, a man who had chosen familial love over the demands of fanaticism. Whispers spread that if a king would not kill his daughter, he might not kill them. It gave men a sliver of hope. She was shy and awkward, but she spoke softly with the men in the courtyard, or read them stories by the glow of the torches on particularly cold nights. Some teased her grayscale scarring, but they learned quickly that she was no fragile thing. Her father had taught her resilience. Even Tormund Mormont, that grizzled warrior, warmed to her, calling her the little bear's friend, for her quiet bravery. And more than once, Stannis found himself gazing upon her and thanking whatever faint flicker of a god had guided him away from the brink of murder. No one knew how the war for the Iron Throne might end. No one could predict what new horrors might march out of the far north. But Winterfell stood, battered yet unbroken. And in those halls, the battered king from the south had found a renewed sense of purpose. He would protect his daughter, his men, and the seat of House Stark until the realm demanded otherwise. Come Lannisters or the Night's King, or the rise of dragons in the east, he would meet them with steel and unwavering resolve. The choice to spare Shireen had proven he still had a soul worth saving. In the eyes of many, that alone made him worth following. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. Winter's bite grew harsher. The nights stretched longer. Yet the north endured as it always had. Ravens flew, carrying messages of precarious alliances, news of the Lannister struggles in King's Landing, rumors of a dragon queen across the sea, and hints that the dead stirred in the far north. In the Godswood, where the weirwood's face stood sentinel, Shireen sometimes read her prayer aloud, calling softly to ancient ears that might or might not listen. She prayed for the safe return of any missing Starks, for the souls of those lost in the war, and for the father who had chosen her life over a pyre of despair. And though the old gods gave no answer, the heart tree's carved eyes seemed less cold than before, as if a vestige of warmth lingered in the whispering leaves. Stannis continued to reign in Winterfell, by necessity more than desire. He wrote to the southern lords, proclaiming he held the north in trust for the rightful king of Westeros. Himself, he reminded them, until such time as the north demanded the restoration of the Stark line. It was an uneasy claim, but the letter carried weight. Some houses in the Riverlands found hope in his unwavering sense of justice. Others scoffed, but the seeds of a new alliance had been planted. And at the root of it all was the simple, stark truth. A father's love for his daughter had changed the course of the North's war. Had Stannis yielded to Melisandre's demands, burned Shireen alive for a promise of a parted storm, the North would have spat in his face forever. He would have proven himself no better than the bastard of Bolton. But by refusing that horror, by clinging to decency, he had gained something more potent than any dark ritual. He had gained trust, and the North's trust was hard-won indeed. As the final days of that grim winter came, and as rumors spoke of the wall being tested by whites, Stannis prepared. The men of House Mormont, House Serwyn, House Manderley, and a growing contingent from House Karstark gathered beneath the battlements. Spears bristled, horses snorted in the cold, black cloaks rippled. They stood ready for a march if the day came that Stannis must join Jon Snow at the wall to defend the realm from nightmares, or to march south to challenge the Iron Throne, whichever threat proved greatest. Shireen stood on the steps that day, Davos at her side, watching the mustering troops in the courtyard. Stannis joined her, placing a gloved hand on her shoulder. She leaned into him slightly. Neither spoke for a time, listening to the clang of steel, the commands of captains, the snarl of the wind. Then Stannis murmured, "One day, perhaps, you shall rule the Stormlands in my stead, or help rule the North if fate desires it. I do not know what tomorrow brings, but I do know that we face it together, father and daughter, blood of my blood." She looked up, blinking away the sting of cold. "I'll try to be brave, father." He allowed the faintest hint of a smile. "You already have been, Shireen, more than I ever realized." He scanned the yard, seeing men in patched armor, battered from the storms, but standing resolute. "And the North has taught me something. A king who does not stand for his own is no king at all." Let the Boltons serve as the final lesson in cruelty. Shireen clasped his hand. Mother would be proud, she said softly, though they both knew Celis had followed Melisandre's counsel to dreadful lengths. She had tried to rationalize the sacrifice, but in the end, she too had knelt before Shireen weeping, and perhaps that moment had changed her as well. Now Celis prayed daily, away from the Red Woman's presence, finding some measure of repentance in the quiet solitude of the castle's September. It was a fragile peace, but it was better than the alternative. Stannis bent and placed a gentle kiss on Shireen's forehead. "Let us see this through," he said, voice gruff with emotion he rarely showed. Then he turned to the men, raising Lightbringer aloft. Sunlight glinted on the steel, a muted glow. They lifted their voices. Some roared Baratheon, others called Winterfell, but their exultation echoed across the courtyard, across the frosted towers. On the walls, the direwolf banners snapped in the wind, a silent homage to the seat's true owners. But for now, King Stannis Baratheon ruled here, having paid for the North's respect not with fire and blood, but with the love he refused to relinquish. And thus, in that moment, the fate of the North stood on a precipice of hope, balanced on the edge of a father's choice. Yet far beyond the castle walls, the snows stretched endless and pale. Beyond them, in the swirling darkness of the unknown, other powers gathered: wildlings, the Night's Watch, the White Walkers, and the faint rumors of dragons. War was not over. Winter was far from finished with them. But Stannis would not bow. He had found within himself a final shred of mercy, and that mercy, paradoxically, made him stronger. For the North had begun to trust him. And while trust alone would not stop the White Walkers, it was a foundation upon which alliances could be built. In the distant heart of the ancient Godswood, the face of the weirwood stood silent, the red sap tears frozen on its carved cheeks. Maybe the old gods had witnessed the atrocity that never was. Perhaps they had judged this southern king and found him worth sparing. No human could say, but in the hush between gusts of wind, one might imagine the faintest creak of branches, the gentlest sigh in the cold air, as though the North itself whispered a guarded acceptance of the king who had spared his daughter's life. And if that acceptance foretold a new future or just another tragedy, none could yet know. But for now, warmth flickered in Winterfell's halls, and a child lived who might have perished, and a father stood a little taller beneath the banner of the direwolf, resolute in his oath to protect what he held dear. A wet snow was falling on Winterfell as dawn broke the next day, each flake large and heavy, drifting down onto the walls and ramparts. The courtyard was already white, though churned by the boots and horse hooves of Stannis Baratheon's men, who rose early for weapons practice. The muffled sound of sword edges clacking against shields, the barked commands of seasoned knights, and the intermittent neighing of horses created a subdued clamor beneath the gray sky. Yet the men were in better spirits than they had been in weeks. They had shelter now and hearth fires, and a king who had shown he would not spill innocent blood for a dubious promise of victory. Winterfell itself bore deep scars from the recent battle. The main gates had needed reinforcing, and the outer walls were punctured in places, blackened where torches and braziers had toppled in the chaos. The great hall's broad doors, once adorned by the direwolf of House Stark, were temporarily patched with heavy oak. Repairs continued day and night, with carpenters and blacksmiths laboring under the watchful eyes of the new occupants. Most of the Bolton banners had been stripped away or burned, replaced by plain cloth or by the Stark direwolf. Stannis had refused to hang the crowned stag of Baratheon over Winterfell's walls. As he told Davos, "This seat belongs to the Starks. I hold it in trust." Yet some men privately whispered that the black stag and the burning heart of the Lord of Light might eventually replace the direwolf for good, if no living Stark could be found. But that was a conversation seldom spoken above a murmur. Stannis awoke that morning and dressed himself in a plain wool tunic, a fur-lined cloak, and thick gloves. The cold was fierce on his older bones, and every year it seemed to sting more sharply. Since the battle, he had taken a simple corner room in the Great Keep as his own. The old lord's chambers, once used by Ned Stark and then seized by the Boltons, smelled of death and rancid blood. He did not want to sleep in those haunted walls. More than that, he preferred to keep an austere presence. Let the Northmen see him as a soldier king, not as a man grasping for southern luxuries. He buckled on a sword, no showpiece, just good steel. Lightbringer lay in a chest nearby, but he preferred not to wear it constantly. The sword, with its legendary name, carried a symbolism he was still coming to terms with. He stepped into the corridor, greeted by one of his guards who snapped to attention. The soldier's breath steamed in the chill air. "Your Grace," the guard said respectfully. He had a battered face and a thick northern accent, for he was one of the men from House Serwyn who had joined after the Boltons' fall. Stannis had learned that many of these men still grieved relatives flayed alive by Ramsay or forced into humiliations under Roose. They welcomed his victory, if not with open devotion, then at least with relief. They all preferred a grim Baratheon to a cruel Bolton. "Good morning," Stannis replied. "Fetch me Ser Davos and Tormund Mormont. I'd have words with them in the courtyard." The guard bowed and went to do his duty. Stannis walked the corridors, noting how the stone walls still showed dark stains from the battle. In one spot, a pillar was cracked, threatening to buckle. Masonry dust drifted to the floor. Repairing Winterfell would require time, resources, and men with enough skill to restore the keep to its old glory. But so far it was holding. The battered fortress seemed to cling to life like an ancient warrior refusing to lie down. It matched Stannis' own state of mind. Down in the courtyard, the day was livelier. Clusters of soldiers sparred with dulled swords, their breath creating small clouds as they grunted and lunged. Horses trotted in circles while stable hands cursed the slush underfoot. A few Karstark men, newly arrived, huddled with Mormont warriors near a corner, their conversation so quiet that only the swirl of steam from their mouths betrayed their speech. Stannis' presence caught their eyes. They moved apart, some bowing stiffly, others averting their gaze. The Karstarks had once backed Robb Stark, then drifted uncertainly after the Red Wedding. They had pinned their hopes on Roose Bolton's claim as Warden of the North, until Roose proved no more trustworthy than his savage son. Now they hovered at Winterfell, uncertain whether to fully support Stannis or to wait for a miracle, a true Stark to return. But each day, they found it harder to deny that Stannis was, at the very least, a more honorable overlord than the Boltons. Davos Seaworth approached, nodding politely to the king as he drew near. Tormund Mormont, no relation to the wildling Tormund Giantsbane, but a cousin to the late Jeor Mormont, strode behind him, a hulking figure with a wary expression. Mormont was older than many of his warriors, with flecks of gray in his beard. He had proven himself fiercely loyal in the fight to take Winterfell. Together, they followed Stannis to a half-roofed area near the stables, where some crates and barrels had been stacked as an improvised war table. "You wish to speak, Your Grace?" Davos asked, shivering slightly. He wore a thick cloak but still felt the cold biting his ears. Even after so many weeks, the northern chill took its toll on a man from the storms of Shipbreaker Bay. Stannis folded his arms. A raven arrived before dawn, bearing news from the Umbers. "It seems they've finally chosen a side. They're mustering men near the last hearth, ready to march if I call upon them to fight. They claim that the Dreadfort is in chaos, that a few leftover Bolton loyalists scattered there might still pose a threat." Mormont offered a grunt. "Aye, the Dreadfort. Cursed place. The bastard's men were known to hide out there, using it as a staging ground for raids and cruelty. But with Roose and Ramsay gone, they're leaderless. Still dangerous, though. Rats are always dangerous cornered." Stannis nodded. "Indeed, the Umbers want a guarantee that if they march for me, they won't be left to starve this winter. I've no illusions that it's loyalty they offer, just caution. They lost men under Robb Stark. They don't want to lose more under a Southerner unless they see a benefit. If we can secure enough provisions from White Harbor and perhaps from the western roads, we might keep the men fed." Davos scratched at his beard. "We're short on supplies as it is. The last shipment from White Harbor was a fraction of what we expected. Lord Wyman Manderley wrote that a series of storms battered his port. He lost ships, or so he claims. He's still sending what he can." Stannis's gaze drifted across the courtyard to where a small group of Manderly soldiers were helping patch a stable roof. We can ill afford to feed thousands more men then. Yet I need the Umbers if I'm to maintain control of the north, whether to stand against any Lannister incursion or, gods forbid, the threat from beyond the wall. If I cannot unify these houses, we'll be as scattered as leaves before a storm. Mormont rested a heavy hand on a crate. Perhaps the Umbers can feed themselves from their own stores. The last hearth was well provisioned for the winter, or so I heard, and they have game in the wood. If they march, maybe they bring their own supplies or at least enough for a few months. Stannis gave a curt nod. I'll send a raven at once, then. We will accept their offer, but they must feed themselves. In return, they share in the spoils of any victory. The Dreadfort stores, meager though they might be, might tide them over. Meanwhile, our men secure the entire region, finally stamping out any Bolton holdouts. A pause, then a short exhale. It is one corner of the board, but we must see every corner secure. Davos inclined his head. Shall I draft the letter for your seal, your grace? Yes, at once. Mormont cleared his throat. If we take the Dreadfort, do we hold it for ourselves, or do we let the Umbers do it? They'll want a share in the spoils, but the castle has always been Bolton land. The North might not look kindly on the Mormonts or Umbers taking it. The Dreadfort is a viper's nest, Stannis said, his tone iron. It can remain vacant or be given to a loyal northern house that has no strong seat of its own. That can be decided later in council. For now, I only care that the Boltons and their lackeys have no place left to regroup. Mormont nodded, apparently satisfied. Stannis then dismissed him. The big man bowed stiffly and walked off, calling to a few of his men as he left the courtyard. Davos lingered, close enough to see the lines of fatigue in Stannis's face, the reddened rims of his eyes. The king stood in the drifting snow, a lonely figure, as though the wind might whip him away at any moment. You should rest, your grace, Davos said softly, glancing around. These last weeks have taken their toll. You've hardly slept. Stannis blinked, as if remembering that men needed sleep. I'll rest when the realm is safe, if that day comes. He exhaled. I have another matter to discuss, Davos. Shireen. She's so often alone here. Celis is still sequestered, praying in the keep September. I see my daughter daily, but not enough. She's seen more darkness than any child should. I wonder if the library can be repaired enough to give her a place to study, perhaps to keep her mind on better things. Davos's features softened. I'll see to it, your grace. Some of the old scrolls and volumes from the time of Ned Stark remain. The Bolton men didn't see much value in burning the library, so it's largely intact. We'll bring Shireen there. It might do her good. A few of the old librarians survived or fled before the Boltons took over. We might see if any are still in the area. Stannis gave a grunt that might have been gratitude. Yes, anything to keep her occupied. The girl deserves some semblance of a childhood. I owe her that much. Consider it done, Davos said. Then he inclined his head. I'll draft the raven for the Umbers, and perhaps see to the library afterward. They parted ways. As Davos strolled toward the hall to retrieve parchment and quill, Stannis stood a moment longer, feeling the cold seep through his cloak. Around him, soldiers hoisted lumber, hammered nails, or tested the sharpened points of newly forged spears. The sound of construction mingled with the subdued hum of men at work. It had been so long since Stannis had known a moment free of tension. That was the truth of kingship, constant vigilance. Yet a spark of warmth lingered in him, tied to the knowledge that Shireen was safe, that she slept beneath sturdy roofs, not out in the wilderness. His musings were cut short by the arrival of Melisandre. The Red Woman seemed to glide across the muddy snow, her crimson robes an eerie contrast to the pale surroundings. She inclined her head, a strange half-smile on her lips. Your Grace, she greeted, voice as soft as an evening breeze. The Lord of Light gave me a vision last night. I wish to tell you of it. Stannis turned, tension coiling in his shoulders. They had not spoken at length since the battle. since he had refused her final push to sacrifice Shireen. "Speak, then," he said, trying to keep any bitterness from his tone. Melisandre drew closer, so that the swirling flakes touched her fiery hair. Her eyes glowed with that peculiar red sheen. "I saw the wall, tall and glimmering with ice under moonlight. Beyond it, an army of shadows moved, corpses walking on dead feet. But I also saw the courtyard of Winterfell. A great darkness tried to enter, but was held at bay by some flicker of warmth. A father's love, perhaps. And I saw that father's shadow entwined with a gray direwolf in the flames. The direwolf was wounded, yet howling, as if calling for kin to return. The shapes twisted, uncertain. The visions are never perfectly clear, but they point to conflict soon to come. The storms will not relent simply because you hold Winterfell." Stannis listened without interruption. Once, he had clung to her words with fervent hope. Now he received them with caution. The shadows beyond the wall are the others, White Walkers, if the tales hold any truth. Jon Snow wrote to me of them. I've seen the aftermath of their raids. You need not be a prophet to know they come. Melisandre's expression did not change. True, but the part about the gray direwolf, the father's love, this is new. The flames speak of shifting fates. You refused the sacrifice, yet you survived and won this seat. That defies many expectations, even some of my own. The cost of that defiance may still come due in another way. I am no seer, Stannis said, but I know well enough that war demands payment. If the others march, we stand or we fall, with or without your flames. My choice stands. Shireen is under my protection, no matter what you see in your fire. She regarded him for a moment with something akin to pity or distant affection. Of course, your grace, but know that I have rededicated my prayers to Lawler, the great other stirs in the north. We shall need every bit of light we can muster. He did not dismiss her words entirely. He had seen too much evidence of strange powers to ignore them, but he would never again let her override his own conscience. Pray, then, he said wearily. Pray for the living. If your God can help the realm fend off the darkness, I will be grateful. She inclined her head, but her eyes flickered. Then, with a swirl of red fabric, she turned and walked away, footsteps silent on the snow. Stannis watched her depart, recalling the nights when her presence had enthralled him. He remembered the moment in the north when she had shown him illusions in the flames, victories and conquests that never quite materialized as promised. She was powerful but far from infallible. He had learned that to his near ruination. He moved on, crossing the courtyard. A few men saluted him, and he returned a curt nod. Then he climbed the worn steps of the great keep to find Shireen. Inside, the stone hallways were drafty, though warmer than outside thanks to the torches and braziers. He passed by the old solar that once belonged to the Starks, its door half off its hinges. Along the corridor, scuff marks and chipped plaster revealed signs of the fight for Winterfell. At last, he turned into a side passage leading to a smaller suite of rooms. 2 Baratheon guards stood on either side of the door, which bore only the wax-stamped crest of Stannis's crowned stag. They nodded as he approached. "Is my daughter within?" Stannis asked them quietly. "Yes, your grace," replied the guard on the left. "She's been reading all morning." Stannis opened the door. The room inside was simple but decently furnished. A bed with furs and linens, a small table with a flickering lamp, and a high-backed chair pulled near the hearth. Shireen sat in that chair, wrapped in a heavy cloak, poring over a leather-bound tome. Her hair, dark and slightly tangled, framed her face. The grayscale scarring on her left cheek looked starker in the uneven light. She glanced up, eyes brightening when she saw him. "Father," she said, her voice quiet but eager. She stood, nearly dropping the book in her haste. "You're finished with your duties?" Stannis closed the door behind him, stepping inside. The warmth was welcome on his cold cheeks. He took a moment to study her, feeling a pang of guilt for how seldom he truly looked at his daughter. "For now, yes," he replied. "I wanted to see how you fare. Are you cold? Hungry?" She shook her head. Ser Davos brought me breakfast earlier. Warm bread and a little bit of honey. He said the cook found a jar in the cellars. She smiled, as if that simple meal were a grand feast. I'm all right, father. Just reading about the old kings of winter, how the Stark line traces back thousands of years. The book is so old, half the pages are crumbling. Stannis came closer, settling his hand on the back of her chair. He glimpsed the battered text. An ancient history of the kings of winter, their wars against the Barrow kings, the Marsh kings, all the petty northern monarchs who once warred among themselves until the Starks conquered and unified the land. Learning the North's history might be wise, he said softly. You'll understand them better if you know where they come from. Yes, Shireen said, stroking a page gingerly. The Starks, they seem so noble. But the book also says they could be harsh, especially in winter. They'd put criminals to death themselves, hold to their own sense of justice. The North is different from the South, isn't it? Stannis allowed the faintest upward twitch of his lips. Indeed, it is. The North is a place of old gods, old grudges, old loyalties. They don't bend easily, nor do they forget. When you break faith with a Northerner, it becomes etched in stone. She set the book aside, turning to face him more fully. Then why did they accept us, father? After all that's happened, especially the Red Woman's talk of sacrifices. A shadow crossed his eyes. He had not wanted her to dwell on that. They accepted me because, in the end, I refused to do what the Boltons would have done without a second thought. Many men in my army have died for the North's sake. We bled beside them to free this castle from monsters. And in part because, the truth is, Shireen, even a harsh land respects a father's duty. Northerners hold family above all. When they saw that I would not sacrifice you, they deemed me worthy of some measure of trust. She gave him a look of wonder mixed with relief. I'm glad, father, she whispered. I'd be gone if you hadn't. Her voice caught. She looked down, clearly remembering the day she was nearly tied to a pyre. Stannis gently rested a hand on her shoulder, awkward but sincere. It is a dark thing, but I swear to you, never again will I be so blinded by Melisandre's visions or by my own ambition. I cannot undo the torment I caused you, but let me at least guide the North away from tyranny. Let that be my penance. She nodded, tears hovering at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away and tried to smile. Yes, father. He noticed the dryness in his own throat. Comforting had never been his strength. Robert was the one who could charm and console with ease. But this was his child, and he had nearly lost her to madness. Ser Davos tells me the old library might be reclaimed for you, he said, changing the subject to something less painful. It's said to be well stocked with histories and lore from the Age of Heroes onward. Would you like that? A spark of delight lit her face. Truly? I'd love to see it. I read all I could while we were at Dragonstone and Castle Black, but the library at Dragonstone was small, and the one at the wall was for the Night's Watch records, mostly. A new library, new stories. She pressed her hands together. When may I go? Stannis allowed himself a faint, dry chuckle. Soon. Davos will see to it, probably by tomorrow or the next day. It may be cold and dusty, but you can take a brazier with you. Wear gloves if you handle the older scrolls. I don't want you coughing up dust for a week. She nodded eagerly, and he felt a strange tightening in his chest, something like pride. She reminded him, in a small way, of how he once devoured texts about the realm's laws and histories, desperate to understand the intricacies of rule while Robert roamed the training yards. Each of them had sought recognition in different ways. Now, ironically, it was Shireen who yearned for knowledge most of all, perhaps because it was safer than the outside world. Thank you, father, she whispered. He patted her shoulder one more time, then straightened. Rest here for now. A cart of old furs arrived from White Harbor. I'll have them bring you a thicker cloak for walking about the castle. We must keep you from freezing. She nodded, then paused. Will you dine with me tonight? You never eat with me anymore, father. We've always had war councils or something. He felt a pang, remembering the feasts at Dragonstone when Celis, grim and aloof, had presided, and Shireen had shrunk in the shadows while Melisandre hovered. "Yes, I will," he said simply. "Tonight, in my solar, I'll have the cooks prepare something hot. Just you and me." "Agreed." Shireen's smile was small, but genuine. "Yes." He turned and left, telling himself he would not forget that promise. The day unspooled with the usual tension of a castle in flux. Davos penned the message to the Umbers, dispatched the Raven, then oversaw efforts to clear a collapsed walkway on the second level. Melisandre drifted in and out of the Godswood, presumably seeking visions or praying at the Heart Tree. The Mormonts continued drilling with the other northern men. Around midday, a small group of Karstark riders departed, bound for their family seat, to confirm that Stannis' rule was worth supporting. Every hour brought a fresh challenge, but step by step, the battered fortress was healing. Come evening, the snow turned to sleet, and an icy rain rattled against the windows. Stannis arranged a simple meal in his makeshift solar, a table, 2 chairs, and a brazier for warmth. The meal was no grand feast. Roast turnips, a bit of salted fish, some barley bread, and weak ale, but it was hot and filling. Shireen arrived dressed in a thicker cloak, her cheeks flushed from the cold corridor. Ser Davos accompanied her briefly, but she insisted she would be fine alone with her father. Davos bowed and excused himself, leaving them to their quiet meal. They sat by the brazier, the flicker of flame casting dancing shadows on the walls. For a while, they ate in a companionable silence, broken only by the clink of cutlery against wooden plates. Shireen sipped some watered-down ale and made a face. Stannis frowned slightly, then poured her a cup of hot broth instead. After a time, she ventured softly, "Father, may I ask something about the war?" He set his cup down. "Speak. Why does everyone talk about the White Walkers? But I've never seen them. Melisandre says they're real and terrifying, yet no one seems to know how to fight them." Stannis studied her solemn face. "Some have seen them beyond the wall. Jon Snow for one. The free folk or wildlings speak of them too. They say the White Walkers command the dead, raising them as wights to do their bidding. I have not encountered them personally, but I've seen enough to believe they exist." She swallowed. "Are they coming here? To Winterfell?" "It's possible." He did not lie to her. "If the winds blow cold enough and the wall can't hold them back, they may sweep across the north. That's why the realm must unite. Men squabble over thrones, but if we don't stand together, we'll all fall to the dead. That's what Jon Snow warned me." Shireen shivered, not from the cold. "It's frightening." Stannis inclined his head. "War is frightening, and these creatures are worse than any mortal foe. We'll do all we can to stop them." She looked down at her plate, quiet. He let her be. After a long pause, she asked, "Father, if the Stark children come back, Bran, Rickon, or even Sansa, will we leave Winterfell to them? Will we go home?" Stannis felt the weight of that question like a stone in his chest. He had claimed to hold Winterfell only in trust, but the Iron Throne was still his ultimate goal, and the North was crucial to that pursuit. "That depends," he said carefully. "If a true Stark heir can be found, one recognized by the North, then yes, I'll see Winterfell returned to its rightful line. My war is with those who destroyed the realm's justice, the Lannisters, their allies, and any who stand in my path. But I'll not steal what belongs to another great house, especially not one that has suffered so much." Shireen seemed relieved. "I hope they come back. I read so many tales about them, about how they kept the North safe. I wonder if they'd like me." Her timid tone made his chest tighten. "I'm sure they would," he said quietly, remembering that the children of Ned Stark had once been rumored to be kind-hearted, except for that wild streak in Arya and the solemn, dutiful nature of Robb. But they had been scattered to the winds, half-rumored dead. "One day, perhaps you'll meet them." She brightened a little. "Yes, I hope so." They continued their meal in relative peace, speaking of smaller matters. How the library might be reorganized, whether the well in the courtyard needed deeper excavation, how a stray cat roamed the corridors at night. Shireen giggled once, describing how the cat had startled a guard into dropping his spear. Stannis listened, finding a rare flicker of contentment in the small talk. This was father and daughter, not a king and a subject. When they finished, Shireen rose and curtsied, an old habit. "Thank you, father. I've missed eating with you like this." He nodded. "It's good to spend time." Then, in an uncharacteristically gentle tone, he added, "Sleep well, my sweet girl. If the storm abates, you can visit the library tomorrow." She smiled, overcame her timidity, and quickly wrapped her arms around his waist in a brief hug. He stiffened, still unused to such warmth, but he placed a hand on her back. Then she let go and hurried out, leaving him alone with the guttering brazier and the quiet hush of the solar. Stannis stared at the flickering coals a while longer, pondering the path that lay ahead. Jon Snow's letters weighed on his mind. The White Walkers, if half the tales were true, they were unstoppable by normal means. Dragonglass, Valyrian steel, these were rumored to be their weakness. But forging alliances to fight an inhuman threat required more unity than Westeros had shown in generations. Could he truly gather the realm? Even if he succeeded, the cost would be staggering. Yet he resolved to try. The alternative, allowing the living to be slaughtered by an army of the dead, was unthinkable. At last, he left the table and returned to his duties. There were dispatches to read, men to see, and the future to shape. By the next morning, the icy rain had dwindled. A bitter wind scoured the ramparts, but the sky was clearer, revealing a pale sun. Shireen, brimming with excitement, asked Davos if they might go to the library. True to his word, Davos had arranged for a pair of Mormont guards to help clear the rubble and dust from the old library wing. He led Shireen through a series of corridors that had once been off-limits during Bolton rule, winding passages that had a musty smell, as if sealed away from fresh air for too long. They reached a heavy wooden door bound with iron. One of the Mormonts used a crowbar to pry it open. Rusted hinges shrieked in protest, and a small cloud of dust billowed out, making Shireen sneeze. Inside, the library was a dim chamber lined with shelves from floor to ceiling, many stacked with rolled parchment or old leather-bound tomes. A few large reading desks sat in the center, coated with dust and scattered quills. An old, wide hearth gaped at one end, its chimney angled so the smoke would exit through a vent in the castle's outer wall. A single narrow window admitted a sliver of pale light. Shireen's eyes widened with delight, though the cold inside bit at her cheeks. "It's bigger than the library at Dragonstone," she breathed. "So many shelves." Davos smiled. "Aye, the Starks were readers, it seems. Or perhaps their maesters collected much. Let's get you some warmth." He moved to the hearth, with one of the Mormonts hauling in a brazier and a stack of firewood. Within minutes, they had a small blaze crackling, sending out precious heat into the chamber. A swirl of dust motes shimmered in the flicker. Shireen clutched her cloak around her shoulders. "Thank you, Ser Davos," she said politely. Then she ventured to the nearest shelf, running a gloved fingertip over a row of tomes. Many had rotted spines or titles so faded they were illegible, but a few had gold lettering. "This one says, 'The Legends of the North,'" she read aloud. "And here's a partial copy of The World of Ice and Fire. Oh, that's the genealogical record of the houses. We had a copy at Castle Black." She turned to Davos, eyes shining. "I want to read them all." Davos chuckled. "Then you'll be here until spring, my lady." She didn't correct him. Technically, she was a princess by Southern standards, but Davos's old habit was to call her my lady from their days at Dragonstone. She simply smiled. "I don't mind." The Mormont guards, having ensured the space was safe, retreated to stand in the hallway, leaving Davos and Shireen inside. Davos took a moment to light a few old lanterns hanging from hooks in the walls, casting more illumination across the shelves. The chamber smelled of parchment and leather, a comforting scent to Shireen's senses. She found a stool near the hearth and carefully positioned a stack of books on a table. As she browsed, Davos hovered protectively. He was, after all, her sworn guardian of sorts. Stannis had not named him that in official words, but both knew it was so. "You be careful," he said. "Some of those scrolls might crumble if you're too rough." Shireen nodded. She eased open a battered volume about the long night, reading the first lines that described a war between the living and the dead 8,000 years ago. A creeping chill ran up her spine at the parallels to the rumored threat they faced now. The old tales mentioned heroes like the last hero, Azor Ahai, the Night's King. So many legends half lost in time. As she flipped pages, she murmured softly, "Ser Davos, do you think it's true? The long night and all the terrors? Or is it just a story?" He shifted, frowning. "I once thought it was a tale for children, my lady. But after all I've seen, Shadowbinders, whites at the wall, the things Melisandre can do, I believe the old stories might hold truth. If even half of it is real, we best be on our guard." Shireen nodded, eyes drifting over a hand-drawn illustration of white in human figures. Another small shiver passed over her. She remembered Melisandre's talk of ice and death, of a great other opposed to Lawler. It was unsettling, but she steeled herself. Her father was the king, and he would protect them. Wouldn't he? She set the book aside gently. Another tome caught her attention. A large volume bound in cracked leather, labeled The Secrets of the North. She opened it, only to find that half the pages were missing or burned. The remnants spoke of hidden passages in Winterfell, rumored crypts and tunnels dating back thousands of years. She read a snippet about how King Jon Stark, an ancient ancestor, once sealed a labyrinth beneath the castle, claiming it led deeper than men realized. The text ended abruptly where the pages were torn away. Davos watched her expression. "Something interesting?" "Maybe," she said, glancing at him. "It talks about secret passages. I wonder if that's how Roose Bolton tried to escape. Father said he was found in a hidden passage." Davos rubbed at his chin. Your father's scouts discovered him trying to slip through an old tunnel in the lower cellars. The place was half collapsed, so he couldn't get far." Shireen's curiosity flared. "Do you think we could see those passages? I want to understand Winterfell better." Davos hesitated. "They might be dangerous, unstable, and there's talk of ghosts and the old kings in the crypts. Best not to wander without a proper guide." She sighed but accepted it. "Maybe one day. For now, I have enough to read." She returned to the shelves, rummaging for more. The library was a trove of old stories, genealogies, and half-lost accounts of battles. Many volumes covered the lineages of northern houses. The Ryswells, the Dustons, the Lockes, the Glovers, the Tallhearts. Shireen recognized some names from her father's war councils, and the puzzle pieces started to fit together in her mind. She saw how each house was intertwined by centuries of marriage and grudges. She read about how House Bolton had once rivaled House Stark for dominance, leading to many savage battles in ages past. One reference claimed that the Boltons had even worn the skins of Stark lords, though whether that was a fable or truth was unclear. She looked up from time to time, warming her hands by the brazier. Davos coughed occasionally as dust tickled his throat, but he did not complain. He seemed content to let her explore. After a while, another presence stepped through the doorway. One of the Mormont guards, a tall woman named Lyessa. "Ser Davos," she said quietly. "The king asks for you in the courtyard. He needs your counsel." Davos nodded, turning to Shireen. "Will you be all right here for a bit, my lady? I can leave the guards at the door." Shireen glanced around. The library was quiet, the hearth's warmth comforting. "I'll be fine," she said. "I'll just keep reading." "Very well. Don't strain your eyes." He lifted one of the lanterns and placed it closer to her. "I'll return soon. If you need anything, speak to the guards." Then Davos left with Lyessa, and Shireen was alone. She heard faint footsteps receding, the murmur of voices in the corridor. The library's hush wrapped around her like a cloak. She exhaled, peering at the spines of old tomes, searching for something particularly intriguing. Her gaze landed on a narrow volume, half hidden behind a row of battered ledgers. This title was barely visible, "Lives of the Lords Paramount." Pulling it free, She discovered it was a genealogical text detailing the major lords of Westeros over the past centuries. Lannister, Baratheon, Tyrell, Martell, Arryn, Tully, Stark, Greyjoy. She flipped through, scanning pages until she reached House Baratheon. She saw mention of Orys Baratheon, rumored to be Aegon the Conqueror's bastard brother, who had seized Storm's End after defeating the last Storm King. Then she came upon more recent entries: Robert, Stannis, Renly. Her father, in black ink, described as Lord of Dragonstone, master of ships under King Robert. No mention yet of his claim to the Iron Throne. The text was too old for that. Farther on, she reached House Stark. The last recorded generation, presumably penned shortly after Robert's rebellion, listed Eddard Stark, married to Catelyn Tully, with children: Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, Rickon. Another note indicated a supposed bastard, Jon Snow, though Shireen knew that bastard lines were seldom fully detailed. Her brow furrowed. All these children scattered or dead. The North was starved for their return. She traced a fingertip over Rickon's name, the youngest. He would be close to her age. The book said nothing more, just the name, birth date, and a note that he had been a baby when the rebellion ended. She wondered if he was truly alive somewhere. She wondered if Sansa was alive. Reports varied. Restless, Shireen placed the genealogical volume aside. She drifted to a different shelf, rummaging at random until she came upon a set of scrolls stuffed into a dusty cubby. Carefully, she unrolled the first. It appeared to be a partial map with Winterfell at the center. Strange lines wove beneath the castle's outline, winding passages that might represent some labyrinth. The edges were water-damaged, and half of the writing was smeared away. She caught glimpses of hot springs, secret, then smudges. Her heart fluttered with excitement. This was something new, a puzzle. Maybe it was linked to the references in the Secrets of the North. She unrolled a second scroll. More lines, more cryptic symbols, mostly unreadable. She felt a jolt of curiosity. What if these were schematics for the rumored tunnels? She recalled her father's men discovering Bolton holdouts in a hidden corridor. Could there be more? The text was so faded she could scarcely decipher it. She angled it closer to the brazier, the better to catch the lamplight. Her mind wandered. If there were secret tunnels, might they connect to the old crypts where the Stark kings were buried, each with a statue and a dire wolf at its feet? She'd heard stories from the garrison, how ghosts supposedly roamed down there. Part of her was frightened by the thought, but another part was enthralled by the prospect of hidden history. She felt an odd kinship with those old stories, as if the North's ghosts might somehow understand her own loneliness. She lost track of time, absorbed by the texts, trying to glean anything that was still legible. Now and again, she turned the brittle parchment carefully, brushing away dust motes. The fire crackled behind her, its heat lulling her into a sense of comfort. Shadows flickered on the shelves. Then, faintly, she heard something, a quiet scrape of movement near the far end of the library, behind a tall bookcase. Her heart quickened. "Ser Davos?" she called softly. No answer. Perhaps it was just the wind rattling a loose shutter. She waited, breath caught. The library fell silent again. She shrugged, returning to her parchment. Yet a minute later, the scrape came again, closer to a rustling, almost like footsteps. Shireen stood, gooseflesh prickling her arms. She glanced around the edges of the library. The shelves stretched in rows near the back, some toppled or partially collapsed. Anyone could be hidden there in the gloom. "Hello?" she ventured, stepping away from the table. The firelight cast her shadow at strange angles across the floor. She heard no reply. The wind outside rose in a soft moan. She remembered the stories of ghosts in Winterfell. Her rational mind told her it was likely nothing more than the old building settling, or a rodent scurrying among the debris. Gathering her courage, she inched toward the back shelves, the lantern in hand. Rounding a corner, she saw a collapsed portion of the ceiling had left a pile of debris. Broken beams, scattered stones. Nothing moved. She exhaled. Then she heard a soft scuttling, and a cat darted from behind a broken shelf, eyes gleaming in the lamplight. It was a scruffy gray tom, half feral, hissing at her intrusion. She let out a shaky laugh, relief surging through her. "You scared me," she murmured, lowering the lantern. The cat hissed once more before scurrying away into the darkness. Returning to her table, she was still a bit rattled. But the cat's presence was a relief, far better than some lurking foe. She resumed her seat, telling herself not to be foolish. The library was secure. Davos had assigned guards outside. Soon, her father would insist she retire to her chamber. She reached for another dusty scroll, but a voice behind her made her jolt in her chair. "You should be careful with those." She whirled around, heart pounding. Melisandre stood in the doorway, the ruddy glow from the hearth dancing on her scarlet robes. The Red Woman's sudden appearance was so silent it seemed almost supernatural. I didn't hear you come in," Shireen stammered, clutching the scroll. Melisandre's eyes flicked to the parchment. "You are exploring Winterfell's secrets, I see." She moved closer, each step graceful, as though gliding on air. Knowledge can be a source of light, but it can also lead one astray. Shireen frowned. She remembered all too well how this woman had nearly convinced her father to sacrifice her. Yet after that day, Melisandre had not confronted Shireen directly. This was the first time they'd been alone. "I'm just reading. Father said I could." Melisandre smiled, though it did not warm her eyes. "He no longer heeds my counsel as he once did. You hold a greater power over him now. The power of a child's life he refused to surrender. Your father's choice, as you know, may have changed many fates." Shireen swallowed, uncertain how to respond. She did not trust the Red Woman, but neither did she want to provoke her. "I'm glad he made that choice," she said quietly. "As am I." Melisandre regarded her with a tilted head. "Though the darkness remains, perhaps we have found another path to victory." She bent, taking up one of the partial maps from the table. Her narrow fingers moved over the lines. "Secrets, tunnels, the beating heart of Winterfell. This castle is built over natural hot springs, yes? Some say that heat is what keeps the fortress warm even in the coldest winters. A hidden warmth in the midst of ice." Shireen nodded, feeling uneasy. "That's what the stories say." Melisandre set the parchment down. Her gaze shifted to Shireen's grayscale scar. "Winter is upon us, child, and in the darkest nights, the living must find warmth anywhere they can. You, your father. Everyone here must cling to that spark of life or be consumed." Shireen shivered, but not from cold. "You mean the White Walkers? Father says they might come south." A flicker of something moved in Melisandre's red eyes. Fear, or perhaps fierce determination. "They will come," she said, her voice low, "and all the power of R'hllor will be needed to hold them back. Tell me, girl, do you pray to the Seven? To the old gods of the Weirwood?" Shireen hesitated. I used to pray to the Seven at Dragonstone with Mother, but I never felt like they answered." The question of gods made her uncomfortable. The memory of how the Red Woman would conduct strange rites pressed at her mind. Melisandre nodded slowly. "Prayers are words cast into the darkness, hoping for an echo. Whether you pray to the Seven, the old gods, or the Lord of Light, it is the faith behind them that carries weight." Her gaze lingered on Shireen's scarred cheek. "Know that you are watched, child. The flames have shown me glimpses of your destiny." Shireen stiffened. "My destiny? In one vision, I saw you standing at your father's side against a tide of darkness. But in another, I saw you lost, swallowed by the cold. The lines are not yet fixed." Melisandre's voice was almost tender, yet it sent a chill down Shireen's spine. "I don't understand," Shireen whispered. "I'm not important. Father's the king. I'm just—" "You are his heir," Melisandre said softly, "and you carry royal blood, a potent gift in the eyes of the Lord of Light. My hope truly is that you live to see the dawn, that your father's choice has set us on a path that spares you from any sacrifice. But the war is not done. The Great Other does not surrender so easily. She set a hand lightly on Shireen's shoulder, and the girl felt an odd warmth through the red woman's silk glove. Stay wary, child. Keep reading, yes, but do not wander too far into Winterfell's hidden depths. Some doors, once opened, cannot be shut. Shireen swallowed, eyes round. She wanted to wrench away from that touch, but something held her still. Was it fear or fascination? Melisandre's presence was hypnotic, as if she radiated a subtle heat. "I'll be careful," Shireen managed. Melisandre withdrew her hand, then turned in a swirl of red cloth. "If your father seeks me, tell him I pray for our victory in the Godswood. We must stand together, no matter the past." She glided toward the door, paused. "Take care, Princess Shireen," and then she was gone, leaving Shireen alone with the hush of the library and the crackling fire. Shireen exhaled shakily, feeling as though she just survived an encounter with a wolf or a shadowcat. The red woman's words echoed, two visions. One where Shireen stood at Stannis' side, another where she was swallowed by cold. She didn't know what to make of that. She remembered the day her father had almost... No, she pushed that memory away, tears prickling her eyes. She wasn't about to let fear claim her again. She would read, she would learn, and she would help her father in any way she could. Even if she was just a girl with half her face scarred by grayscale, she wanted to prove her worth. She forced herself to focus on the parchments. Slowly, she regained her composure. The library's warmth and the flicker of the lanterns felt more comforting now that Melisandre had left. Yet she could not entirely banish the disquiet in her heart. Meanwhile, on the ramparts of Winterfell, Stannis Baratheon stood with Davos Seaworth, gazing upon the snow-laden expanse beyond the walls. The storm had cleared enough to reveal a sky of pale, wintry blue. Weak sunlight glinted on fields of snow that stretched to the horizon. Stannis's breath plumed as he spoke in a low tone. "You're certain?" he asked. Davos grimaced. "Yes, your grace. The raven from Castle Black arrived half an hour ago. Jon Snow writes that the tensions at the wall are at a breaking point. The Night's Watch is divided. Some blame him for letting wildlings through. He fears a mutiny." Stannis's jaw clenched. He should have accepted my offer to legitimize him, name him Lord of Winterfell, but he refused, choosing black over a crown. Now the crows betray him. "It seems so," Davos said grimly. "He still begs your aid, or at least your moral support. He has thousands of free folk on the southern side of the wall, all in need of shelter and supplies. The Watch sees them as an army of raiders, not allies. Fights have broken out. Jon Snow tries to keep order, but if the Watch turns on him, the White Walkers might find the wall unprepared." Stannis finished, glaring at the horizon. "Fools, the realm is in peril, and they bicker over tradition." He exhaled frost. "I must decide whether to march to the wall's defense or stay here, hold the north together. The Karstarks are on the edge of joining me fully, the Umbers as well. If I march away, all might crumble." Davos put a gloved hand on the parapet. "Your Grace, the threat beyond the wall is dire. If Jon Snow is ousted or killed, who will hold back the others?" Stannis said nothing for a moment. Then, "I cannot leave Winterfell undefended. The Lannisters may still send forces north, or the Ironborn might raid the coastline again. The north stands upon a knife's edge, but I also cannot ignore Snow's plight. He is a decent man, too honorable for his own good, perhaps." Davos waited, letting him ponder. At length, Stannis sighed. "I'll send a smaller contingent, volunteers, perhaps. Men who can travel swiftly, help Snow hold Castle Black. We'll see if the Karstarks or Mormonts can spare 100 or so. That might be enough to deter open mutiny. The rest of the army remains here with me, fortifying Winterfell and forging alliances." Davos nodded. "A sound plan. Shall I arrange the volunteers?" "Yes, discreetly. Tell them it's a mission in my name. They'll be recognized as my men, so the Watch knows they're not invaders. Send a raven to Snow, instructing him that help is coming, but not a full host. If he needs more, we'll see what can be done." "Very good, Your Grace." Davos hesitated. "Will Melisandre go with them? She once claimed the wall was where her visions were strongest." Stannis scowled. "She's free to go if she wishes, but I doubt she will. She remains fixated on me, or on Shireen. And I'd prefer to keep her under watch here, where I can see her. Let her pray in the godswood if that pleases her. But I don't trust her beyond my sight." Davos inclined his head. "Understood." Stannis drummed his gloved fingers on the parapet. "See to it, then, and have the men keep a close eye on the roads. If the Umbers arrive, I want to greet them before they find the gates shut. Wyman Manderley, too, might come once the weather eases. We must be ready." As Davos withdrew, Stannis let his gaze wander over the harsh beauty of the north. He recalled how, in his youth, the Stormlands had seemed cold and unwelcoming compared to King's Landing. But that was a summer's breeze compared to Winterfell in the heart of winter. The land was bleak, the distances vast, and the old gods lingered in every weirwood. Yet here he stood, king by his own claim, father to a girl he had almost destroyed, and tenuous protector of a castle that belonged to another house. The irony was not lost on him. For a moment, a half-remembered phrase came to him from childhood readings. "The North remembers." Indeed, it did, and Stannis Baratheon meant to earn that memory honestly, without flaying, without burning. Let the North see that he would protect Shireen, protect the people, and drive out any last trace of Bolton cruelty. If he accomplished that, perhaps, just perhaps, the old gods or any god might grant him a measure of redemption. He turned and walked along the rampart, heading for the stairs. Another day of decisions awaited. The North's trust was fragile, like a small flame in a storm, easily snuffed. He must shield it carefully. He must keep his daughter safe, and see that Winterfell endured. He must muster men against both southern enemies and the horrors of the far north. The burden was immense, but he bore it with the grim determination that had once made him Robert's most loyal brother in the siege of Storm's End. Duty had always guided him, duty to the realm, to law, to family. Now, that duty burned brighter with the memory of Shireen's small face on the pyre that never claimed her. He descended the steps, boots clacking on the stone. The meager sunlight glistened on the newly fallen snow, and behind him, the wind carried a faint chorus of hammering and shouting. Men rebuilding a broken seat, forging a new future. Winter might press them all to the brink, but for now they held. And in that precarious hold, father and daughter found a thread of hope that defied the darkness swirling beyond the old gray walls. Days turned into weeks. Word arrived that the Umbers had fully committed, sending 300 men led by a scion of the house to reinforce Winterfell. They rode in one bitter morning, their shaggy horses struggling through drifts of snow. Shouting men at the gates welcomed them inside. The Umbers carried a banner bearing the roaring giant of their house and brought stories of half-frozen Bolton men skulking in the countryside, raiding farmsteads. They pledged to hunt those outlaws down and present their heads to the king. Stannis accepted their fealty with curt thanks, mindful that their loyalty was more pragmatic than heartfelt. Yet loyalty was loyalty. The new arrivals strained Winterfell's resources further, but the Umbers contributed some of their own supplies. They slaughtered a few spare goats, adding the meat to the larders. They also brought barrels of ale, which did wonders for morale. In the great hall, men of Mormont, Serwyn, Karstark, and Umber sat at rough tables, drinking, talking, forging cautious bonds. The hall bustled more than it had in many a year. Shireen sometimes passed the open doors, hearing the raucous laughter of northern men. She found it unsettling and fascinating at once. Stannis' smaller contingent left for the wall soon after. Some Karstarks, a few Mormonts, and a scattering of his southern knights who volunteered. They rode north carrying Baratheon banners, resolved to support Jon Snow. Stannis felt a knot in his stomach as they departed, knowing he was effectively splitting his forces, if they were attacked on the road or if the Lannisters took advantage. But there was no perfect choice. Duty demanded risk. While this movement occurred, the presence of House Karstark grew more cordial. Lord Arnulf Karstark, a sour-faced man rumored to have once conspired with the Boltons, had died in mysterious circumstances. His heir was a younger cousin, Tybalt Karstark, who seemed keen to distance himself from the old man's betrayals. Tybalt arrived at Winterfell to make amends, bringing a small retinue. Stannis greeted him stiffly, but Tybalt bent the knee, apologized for any past misdeeds, and offered a pledge of loyalty. In return, he asked for a share in decisions regarding the Dreadfort's fate. Stannis demurred, uncertain how to reward or punish Karstarks who had been so fickle in alliances. But he acknowledged Tybalt's vow. Another piece on the board. Beyond politics, the day-to-day grind of winter survival dominated. The freezing wind howled. Repairs to the keep's walls continued. Hunters ventured into the Wolfswood, returning with meager hauls of deer and rabbits. But it was never enough to feed the swelling population behind Winterfell's walls. Rations grew tighter. Stannis considered sending some men back to their own holdfasts, so they could sustain themselves off their own lands, but that risked fracturing unity. So he compromised, rotating small groups out to gather supplies or guard roads, then rotating them back in. The Mormont garrison took a turn. The Umbers scouted roads to the last hearth. Men from House Serwyn patrolled southward. Little by little, they tried to keep the lifeblood of the north pumping through the frozen veins of the land. Amid these efforts, Shireen blossomed in her quiet corner. She spent hours each day in the library with Davos or a pair of guards. Sometimes she emerged covered in dust, excited by some new genealogical find. She discovered references to a rumored Stark sword, ice, forged of Valyrian steel, which had been lost after Ned Stark's execution by the Lannisters. She read accounts of old northern kings who battled giants and White Walkers centuries ago. At mealtimes, she would share bits of lore with her father. At first, Stannis listened with a distracted ear. But as the days wore on, he found himself increasingly interested in her discoveries. The swirl of the North's ancient history reminded him that his hold on Winterfell was a mere blink in time. There were also talkative nights in which Shireen's presence at the high table, though overshadowed by grim lords, provided a gentle calm. The men might tease her softly or ask her about her reading. She answered with a mixture of shyness and eagerness. Some gruff northerners even clapped in applause when she recited a snippet of an old saga. Stannis, observing from his seat, realized that the Northmen no longer looked at her with suspicion. Instead, they respected the father who had spared her, and so they treated Shireen with a kind of rough courtesy. It was strange to see, but welcome. Celis Baratheon rarely left her quarters. She spent hours in the small sept, praying to the Seven, occasionally weeping. The near sacrifice of Shireen had shattered her illusions. She had once believed wholeheartedly in Melisandre's pronouncements, championing the idea that Shireen's royal blood must be given to Lawler. Now she seemed consumed by guilt, crossing herself over and over as she begged the mother for forgiveness. Stannis spoke to her infrequently, uncertain how to mend a marriage that had grown so cold. Perhaps time would soften her fervor. Perhaps not. He could not dwell on it. The realm needed all his focus. One crisp afternoon, Shireen ventured to the great keep's rooftop with a Karstark guard to take in the view. She'd read of how Ned Stark's children sometimes practiced archery on the roof. There, she found battered training dummies and a few old targets. The wind was biting, but the sky was clear, revealing a stark panorama of white fields and leafless trees. She gazed out across the courtyard where men hustled below like ants. The guard gave her space, leaning on his spear at a respectful distance. She spotted a figure emerging from a tower doorway, her father, scanning the ramparts as if seeking fresh perspective. She raised a hand in greeting. He noticed her and approached, climbing the last few steps to the roof. "You're braver than me, climbing up here in this chill," Stannis remarked, half in jest. His breath fogged in the freezing air. "What are you about?" She gave a small laugh. "Just seeing Winterfell from above. It's huge, bigger than I realized. The library said there are buried levels and old crypts that run for leagues." Stannis's gaze followed hers. Below, the great hall's roof was patched in places, and the walls bristled with watchmen. "Indeed, it's an old seat," built on older bones. He paused, glancing at her. "Are you happy here, Shireen? The north is harsh." She nodded slowly. "It is harsh, but I feel safer here than on the road. And the library is wonderful. I miss Dragonstone sometimes, but this place, it has a certain quiet strength." He allowed a brief flicker of pride. "It does, yes, and we must preserve that strength for the war to come." They walked along the battlements, mindful of icy patches. Shireen felt a daring impulse and said, "Father, do you think, if the White Walkers come, we can beat them? The old stories say only dragonfire and obsidian can, and we have no dragons." Stannis's mouth tightened. "No, we do not, but we have men, steel, courage. Jon Snow has some supply of dragonglass, I recall. Perhaps we can procure more. And there are rumors. In the east, Daenerys Targaryen has dragons hatched from a funeral pyre." His tone was skeptical. "But that might be a fancy." Shireen's eyes widened. "If it's true, dragons against the White Walkers, that would be like the Age of Heroes, but reversed. I wonder if she'll come here." Stannis shook his head. "Impossible to say. She's across the narrow sea, locked in her own wars. We can't rely on her. We must rely on ourselves." He paused, then added in a softer voice, "And you needn't fear, Shireen. I'll not let anything happen to you." She reached for his hand, and he let her grasp it, a fleeting moment of warmth in the cold. Father and daughter stood looking out over the winter landscape until the bitter wind drove them back inside. As the days went on, talk spread of the final Bolton holdouts. A handful of flayers had terrorized small hamlets, leaving gruesome remains as a message that the flayed man was not dead. Stannis dispatched roving parties to hunt them down. The Umbers and Mormonts led squads of trackers through the Wolfswood, guided by local villagers who had once feared to speak. Gradually, they cornered the stragglers, capturing or killing them. One of the last to be seized was a gaunt man with Bolton livery, found near the banks of the White Knife. He babbled of serving the true Warden of the North, but no one listened. He ended at the headsman's block. With each purge, the realm breathed a little easier, though men muttered that cruelty like the Boltons would never truly vanish. The memory would live on. In time, however, the steady drum of day-to-day struggles overshadowed the remnants of Bolton terror. Snares for rabbits, ration lines for the men, casks of salted fish from White Harbor, arguments between lords over who should guard which tower. This was the life of a castle in winter. Snow piled against the walls, drifting higher each week. The cold seeped into the corridors, forcing men to cluster around fires. Still, Winterfell felt more alive than it had in months. The flayed banners were gone, replaced by a battered direwolf that the inhabitants half saw as a sign of redemption. King Stannis Baratheon presided, a stern presence who demanded discipline but did not skin men or threaten children with burning pyres. That alone was a relief. Sometimes at night, Shireen thought she heard voices in the corridors. Ghostly whispers, or perhaps just the moan of wind. She would wrap herself in furs, imagining the old Stark kings stirring in their tombs. She read more accounts of the crypts and once or twice asked her father if she might see them. He refused, saying it was no place for a child, especially when parts might have collapsed. She acquiesced, but her curiosity only grew. Then one evening, an unexpected visitor arrived at Winterfell's gate, escorted by a pair of Karstark outriders. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, his hood dusted with snow. He wore a cloak of black and brown patched fur, carrying a sword at his hip. When he threw back his hood, his long brown hair showed streaks of gray, and a scar cut across his temple. The guards recognized him as Howland Reed's sworn envoy from the Neck, a retainer of House Reed. He bore a message for Stannis, as well as tidings from the south. They ushered him quickly through the courtyard, ignoring the curious stares of soldiers. House Reed was seldom seen far from the swamps of the Neck. Stannis received him in a smaller chamber off the Great Hall. The man introduced himself as Harlan Marsh, a cousin to Jojen and Mira Reed's family by marriage. He produced a sealed letter bearing the imprint of a small lizard lion. the sigil of House Reed. Stannis broke the wax, scanning the contents. His eyes narrowed in concentration. "What does it say, Your Grace?" Davos asked, standing by. Stannis read it twice before responding. "It says that House Reed recognizes my regency of the North in the absence of any proven Stark. They do not name me king in the North, but they offer their support in keeping the neck closed to any southern forces who might threaten us. In exchange, they request assistance if the Ironborn raid their lands again." Davos exhaled softly. "That's good news, at least." House Reed was loyal to the Starks, but seldom does it openly align with outsiders. Stannis nodded. "They claim they have news about the whereabouts of Rickon Stark." A hush fell. Davos exchanged a stunned look with the king. "Truly?" Stannis frowned at the letter's last lines. "We have word from travelers that Rickon Stark may be hidden in the lands beyond the Bay of Seals. A savage place, Skagos. But rumor says a small band guided by Osha the Wildling took him there for safety after the fall of Winterfell. The Manderleys tried to confirm it, but the seas were too dangerous." Stannis's voice fell. "Skagos, that island of cannibals, if you. More is correct." Davos set his jaw. "If this is true, the rightful heir to Winterfell is alive. Or at least, he was when last heard of." Stannis eyed him shrewdly. "You recall the boy, no doubt, though you never met him. Perhaps 5 or 6 years old when Ned Stark was executed. If Rickon is alive, the North will rally to him in an instant. Even I cannot deny that the blood of Stark runs thick in these lands." Davos inclined his head. "Aye, they would. But he's only a child, he'll need guidance. And if he's truly on Skagos, rescuing him might be a perilous quest. Do we trust these rumors?" Stannis shook his head. "Trust is a strong word. But if we ignore the rumor and the boy is indeed alive, the North will despise us for not searching. If we search and find nothing, we've wasted time and men in a fool's errand." He exhaled. "Reed suggests that Manderley might attempt a secret voyage to Skagos once winter breaks enough to allow a ship along the coast. But that might be months away." Davos considered. "It might be worth the attempt. If the North learns you withheld this rumor, they might see you as trying to hide a Stark heir." Stannis's eyes hardened. "I will not stoop to the duplicities of the Boltons. If Rickon Stark lives, I will see him return to Winterfell. Then the lords can decide if they still need me." Harlan Marsh waited quietly as they spoke. Stannis returned his attention to the envoy. "Tell your lord, Howland Reed, that I accept his pledge. He may keep the neck sealed. If the Ironborn attack, we will send what aid we can. As for Rickon Stark, we shall pass the word to the Manderleys. Perhaps we can mount an expedition, if the seas allow." The king's voice grew sterner. "But be mindful. If this rumor proves false or a trap, I will hold all who spread it accountable." Harlan Marsh bowed with dignity. "House Reed stands by its word, Your Grace. We do not lie about such matters. We only share what we have learned. Whether the boy is truly on Skagos, we cannot say, but the rumor is persistent." Davos cleared his throat. "Your Grace, might we invite Lord Wyman Manderley himself to Winterfell? He has so far sent only envoys and supplies. Perhaps if he comes in person, we can discuss a potential voyage to Skagos." Stannis considered. "Yes, write to him again, emphasize the urgency. If a Stark lives, the North must know. If the seas are impassable, we plan for spring. Perhaps in the meantime, we send ravens to any garrison near the Bay of Seals. See if they can glean more. This is not a trifling matter." Davos nodded. "As you say, Your Grace." They dismissed Harlan Marsh to be lodged in the keep as a guest, then stared at each other in the fading lamplight. The revelation lingered like a tangible weight in the air. If Rickon Stark was alive, Stannis' entire kingship in Winterfell might be undone. Yet Davos saw no fear in Stannis' eyes, only a grim acceptance. The king repeated his vow. "I hold Winterfell for House Stark, if any remain." Those words resounded with new significance now. That night, Shireen heard rumors swirling in the corridors. A boy Stark, living on a savage island. She approached her father at supper time, eyes alight with curiosity. Father, is it true? A messenger says Rickon Stark might be on Skagos. Stannis nodded curtly. Yes, child. It may be nothing but rumor, or it may be fact. We mustn't place too much faith in it. But if the boy lives, we'll do what we can to find him. Shireen's face glowed. That's wonderful. If he comes back, he can have Winterfell, right? And we can. He raised a hand gently to quell her excitement. If he lives, the North will rally around him. As for what happens next, that remains to be seen. I'll not cling to a seat that belongs by right to House Stark. But this realm must also consider the war at our doorstep. There's more at stake than a single castle. She nodded, sobered. Of course. He offered a faint smile. But yes, it would be a good thing to restore a living Stark to these halls. Ned Stark was an honorable man. I can only hope his son is likewise. Now eat your supper. She did so, though her mind whirled with images of a boy her own age stepping into Winterfell, claiming the seat with a direwolf at his side. She imagined how the Karstarks, Mormonts, Umbers, Serwyns, all the northern houses, might kneel for him, and what that would mean for her father's cause. It was both thrilling and frightening. Time pressed on, with winter's relentless chill only growing deeper. Stannis awaited word from the Manderleys, but the roads were nearly impassable by heavy snow, and rumors said White Harbor itself was partially frozen. Still, the everyday work of survival continued. Gradually, the outlying houses bent closer to Stannis, or at least acknowledged his authority. House Glover sent a token of support, albeit grudging, having lost many men under King Robb Stark. The Ryswells sent queries about trade routes. The Dustons remained aloof. But the North was no longer at war with itself, which was a victory of sorts. In the library, Shireen discovered more fragments about Skagos, ancient references to cannibal clans, unicorns, and savage forests. She gleaned that the people there were fierce, but occasionally loyal to the Starks. She wondered how Rickon might fare among them, if indeed he was there. She told Davos about her readings. He nodded gravely, repeating that the place was near inaccessible in winter. If any rescue came, it would wait for calmer seas. Shireen thought it sad to imagine a boy stranded in such a place. Still, hope lingered in her heart. Outside, the nights lengthened. Men whispered that the long night might come again. Melisandre was seen often in the Godswood, kneeling in the snow beneath the red leaves of the heart tree, her lips moving in silent prayer. Some nights, watchers on the walls claimed to see a faint glow emanating from that spot, as if invisible flames flickered around her. Others dismissed it as tricks of moonlight. The Red Woman rarely spoke openly anymore, except to remind Stannis that the true war lay ahead. He rarely answered her. Their relationship had shifted into a tense coexistence, like flint and steel that might spark at any moment. Yet, for the time being, a fragile peace held. Weeks bled together. The air was bitterly cold. The greatest fear now was famine. Stannis tallied the stores daily with Davos and the Castellan. Although White Harbor had promised more shipments in the new year, the blockade of ice on the White Knife made navigation treacherous. A single misplaced chunk of ice could crush a small ship's hull. The supply line wavered. Hunters took greater risks, venturing farther. Some never returned. In this climate of worry, another messenger from Castle Black arrived, half-frozen, face raw from windburn. He brought a shorter letter from Jon Snow. The Watch was on the brink of open rebellion against him. The Free Folk were restless, and mutineers plotted to unseat him as Lord Commander. The letter pleaded for additional men, any who might lend authority and quell the dissent. Stannis' smaller contingent, commanded by a Karstark captain, had arrived, but they were too few to turn the tide. Stannis read it in silence, then crumpled the parchment. "The boy is a fool, but an honorable one," he told Davos. "The Watch might tear itself apart while the White Walkers gather. We can't let that happen." Davos blew out a breath. "We've given him what we could spare." "It's not enough," Stannis snapped. "If the Walkers cross the wall, the entire realm is doomed. Even the Northmen who scorn me will freeze and die. We must keep the Night's Watch united." Davos shook his head. "We can't leave Winterfell defenseless. If you marched north with a host, The castle might fall prey to any Lannister or Ironborn push. Or the North might revolt at your absence. Stannis paced, each step measured. Perhaps I don't need a full host. I could lead a smaller force, just enough to bolster Snow, put down the mutiny. The rest remain here under the command of you or Tormund Mormont. I'd be gone a few weeks at most. He paused. But the roads are near impassable. Many men would freeze just getting there. A dire gamble, Davos said quietly. But you are the king, your grace. The choice is yours. Stannis exhaled, controlling his frustration. We'll see if the Karstarks or Umbers can spare men. In the meantime, write Snow that I cannot march immediately. The storms are too fierce. He must hold as best he can. Davos nodded, making a mental note. He could see the strain in Stannis' face. A man juggling too many crises at once. We'll pray the weather breaks. Stannis let out a humorless laugh. Pray to which god? Davos? The Seven ignore us. Lawler demands a price I'm no longer willing to pay. The old gods are silent, but we must do what we must regardless. Late that same night, Shireen had trouble sleeping. She lay awake, listening to the wind keen outside her window. A single candle flickered on a small table, its flame dancing with every draft. She thought of the White Walkers, of Rickon Stark in far-off Skagos, of the threat of mutiny at Castle Black. Too many worries for a child's mind. At length, she decided to do the only thing that calmed her, read. She rose quietly, donned her cloak and boots, and slipped into the corridor. 2 Baratheon guards blinked at her in surprise, but she mumbled something about fetching a book from the library. They followed a few steps behind as she made her way through the torchlit halls. The library door stood closed. She pushed it open, stepping into the chilly darkness beyond. The hearth's fire was banked low, glowing embers the only light. She lit a lantern from a wall sconce, then dismissed her guards to wait by the door. I'll be safe, she said. No one else is here. They nodded reluctantly, taking positions outside. Inside, the familiar smell of old parchment comforted her. She made her way to the table near the hearth. A stack of books she'd been perusing lay there. She picked one up, glancing through the pages. Then she paused, hearing a gentle scraping sound. Was that the cat again? She stepped toward the back shelves, lantern raised. Dust motes swirled. No cat appeared, but that nagging curiosity about the crypt passages tugged at her. She remembered the partial map from earlier. Perhaps if she studied it again, she'd glean more details. With the flickering lantern, she scanned the shelves until she found the old scroll. Carefully, she carried it back to the table. Under the lantern's glow, she traced the lines. A rough blueprint of Winterfell's underlevels. On one side, she saw a marking that looked like a spiral. Another scribble might be the crypt entrance. Secret door behind the statue of Brandon. Leads deeper? She whispered, reading the faded text. She wasn't certain which Brandon it referred to. There were many in Stark history. The rest of the writing was too smeared to decipher. She frowned in frustration, wishing she could solve the puzzle. A sudden gust rattled the window shutters. Her lantern flickered. Then she heard a voice behind her. You're up late, child. She spun around, heart pounding. But relief eased her when she recognized the speaker. Davos Seaworth. He stood in the doorway, the gloom framing his gruff features. Ser Davos, you frightened me, she said. My apologies, he said, stepping forward. The guards outside told me you were in here. Couldn't sleep. She shook her head, hugging the scroll to her chest. No, too many thoughts. He approached slowly, stopping by the hearth to stir the embers. Sparks leapt, giving them a bit more light. It's understandable. These are troubled times. She nodded. And I keep reading about these old passages. The library is full of references. Some lead to the crypts, some to who knows where. She unrolled the scroll a bit to show him. I wish I could see them, just to know what's really there. Davos gave a soft chuckle, glancing at the faint lines of the scroll. A labyrinth under Winterfell. If half the stories are true, we might wander down there until spring. She placed the scroll gently on the table. I know Father forbids it, but it's all so fascinating. Davos's expression turned thoughtful. You're like him, always seeking to understand. He read about the realm's laws while Robert trained at arms. Maybe you inherited more than you think. Shireen smiled timidly. She liked the idea of sharing something with her father besides the Baratheon name. Ser Davos, do you believe the crypt ghosts are real? He shrugged. I'm no believer in ghosts, but I've seen shadows do dark deeds. So who's to say? The North is old, and old places have power. His gaze flicked to her scar. You've survived your own battles, my lady. Perhaps you understand darkness better than most. She looked down, running her fingers over the rough edges of the parchment. I suppose, but I still want to see for myself. Maybe I'd be braver if I just went and looked. Davos exhaled, glancing around as though he might be overheard. Your father would have my head if I let you go stumbling about the crypts. She sighed. I know. It's just... She paused, collecting her thoughts. I feel like the North's secrets might help me understand everything. The White Walkers, the Old Kings, House Stark. Maybe even the reason Father was spared when we faced that terrible storm. Davos rested a hand on her shoulder, fatherly in his own way. Your curiosity does you credit. But remember, knowledge can be dangerous if you don't tread carefully. Let's keep you safe up here for now. She nodded, though her eyes lingered on the scroll. Yes, Ser Davos. He guided her to put the parchment back on the shelf. Come on. I'll walk you to your chamber. You need rest, or you'll be yawning in your breakfast tomorrow. She obeyed, though a small part of her still yearned to explore the hidden depths beneath Winterfell. One day, she told herself. One day she might see them. For now, she returned to her room, lamp in hand, and drifted off into a fitful sleep haunted by glimpses of long-dead kings and crypt corridors stretching endlessly into darkness. Time ground forward. Weeks became a month, then more. Winter bared its fangs with ferocity, burying roads under drifts as tall as a man. The Karstarks, Umbers, Mormonts, and other northern allies hunkered down in Winterfell, grateful for hot springs that warmed parts of the fortress from beneath. Food ran short. Horses grew gaunt. Some men muttered that they should break up into smaller groups and return to their own lands, but Stannis forbade it. Too dangerous in the storms, and it risked fracturing their unity. Amid the hardships, a letter finally arrived from Lord Wyman Manderley himself. It bore news that the harbor in White Harbor was largely frozen, that ships were blocked by ice floes. Manderley promised that as soon as a channel opened, he would attempt to send an expedition to Skagos, or at least gather more intelligence. He also wrote that he intended to visit Winterfell personally once the weather improved, swearing anew that he was committed to seeing the rightful guardians of the North restored. A carefully worded phrase which did not outright proclaim Stannis as that guardian, but also did not deny his place. Stannis read the letter by candlelight in his solar, with Davos and Melisandre present. After finishing, he tapped a finger on the parchment. So Manderley hints that if Rickon is found, the North will hail him as their liege. That means I become a caretaker at best. But for now, Manderley does not challenge me. He sees the Boltons are gone, so he's willing to wait and see how events unfold. Melisandre stood by the brazier, hands folded in her crimson sleeves. The flames still show many paths, she said quietly. A child with a wolf's blood, hidden among cannibals. Whether he returns or perishes, I cannot say. Stannis shot her a guarded look, remembering how once she had been certain only his sacrifice of Shireen could bring victory. Now her predictions were less absolute. If the boy is indeed alive, I will not hinder his return, he said firmly. The realm has enough tarnish. I will not add stolen inheritance to the list. Davos gave a small nod of approval. An honorable course, your grace. Melisandre inclined her head, eyes flickering. And the war beyond the wall, my king? The true war. Have you decided whether you will ride forth to aid Jon Snow? Stannis's mouth hardened. I have not. The storms remain fierce. We cannot risk losing half our men to the cold. For now, we hold Winterfell. Should an opportunity arise or Snow's letters grow more desperate, we may attempt a smaller rescue. I'll not watch the Night's Watch fall while we cower here. Melisandre's lips curved slightly. Then all is as it must be. Stannis scowled, still wary of her cryptic acceptance. I do what duty demands. That is all. Davos, see that Manderly's letter receives a polite response. Inform him we await his visit when feasible. Right away, Your Grace, Davos said. As Stannis stood to dismiss them, Melisandre's red eyes bored into him. Remember, my king, the Lord of Light still watches. When darkness falls in its truest form, the flame of life must be guarded more fiercely than any fortress. A choice once made can echo across the realm. He stared at her, recalling how that choice nearly cost him his soul. I need no reminder. She dipped her head and swept out, robes trailing like living embers. Davos exchanged a glance with Stannis, then followed the Red Woman from the Solar, leaving the king alone with his silent thoughts. Snow continued to accumulate, day upon day, until Winterfell resembled a white-capped island in a frozen sea. Food stores dwindled dangerously. The hunts often returned empty-handed. Men grew irritable, scuffles erupting over trifles. One Serwyn soldier stabbed a Mormont man in a brawl over a stolen sausage. Another threatened to desert. Stannis enforced discipline harshly, ordering thieves whipped, but not maimed. He balanced severity with a reluctant mercy, mindful that every man might be needed in battles yet to come. To stretch supplies, they rationed bread and barley more strictly. Shireen found her own meals shrinking: thin stew, watery ale, stale bread. Yet she did not complain. She saw how many men were worse off. Some coughed in the corridors, succumbing to winter fevers. A few died, their bodies discreetly carried outside for burial in the frozen ground. The courtyard became a grim place at dawn, with men huddled for warmth, their breath clouds forming a haze in the air. Amid these hardships, faintly hopeful rumors circulated that the ice in White Harbor might be breaking due to shifting currents. If so, Manderly might yet send supplies. Meanwhile, small caravans from the Neck arrived with meager portions of preserved fish and eels, a bizarre fare for the northern palate. The men ate what they could. If not for the hot springs under Winterfell, many might have frozen outright. As the new year turned, a day came when the skies cleared enough for watchers on the walls to see black specks moving across the plains. Dozens, perhaps hundreds. A hush spread as men gathered to watch. Stannis himself ascended the battlements, Davos at his side. Through an old Myrish lens, they discerned a column of travelers heading for Winterfell. White Harbor banners fluttered along with the personal standard of House Manderly, a merman with a trident. Stannis lowered the lens, face thoughtful. So he comes in earnest, the king said. Lord Wyman Manderly, Davos confirmed. He might bring supplies or men. Let's hope it's enough to see us through. Stannis nodded. Prepare to open the gates. We'll greet him. Let him see that we keep order here, despite the shortage. Men rushed to clear the courtyard of clutter, shoveling snow aside. The battered gates swung wide. In the swirl of midday light, the Manderly procession entered. At their head was Wyman Manderly himself, enormous in girth, bundled in furs that made him look like a waddling bear. Behind him rode knights and retainers, leading sledges piled with crates. A wave of relief whispered through Winterfell's ranks, hope that food might be in those crates. In the courtyard, Stannis stood with Davos, Tormund Mormont, and other key figures. Manderly dismounted, or rather, was helped down by two attendants. He bent one knee to Stannis, though the effort made him wheeze slightly. Your Grace, he said in a booming voice, I come bearing respect, and what succor I can offer in these dire times. Stannis inclined his head. Lord Manderly, your arrival is welcome. We feared the harbor was locked in ice. It was, but the seas stirred enough to break a channel. I seized the chance, Manderly rumbled. I bring flour, salt fish, some pickled vegetables, a cask or two of ale. Not enough to feast every man here, but enough to keep them from gnawing their boots. Davos quietly beamed. This might be the salvation they needed. Stannis, in his typical laconic manner, said, "We are grateful. You may store your supplies in the Great Hall. My quartermasters will see them rationed fairly." Manderly nodded, jowls shaking. "I also come to discuss a matter of mutual concern, young Rickon Stark. I have not forgotten my oath to the Starks. If the boy lives, White Harbor stands ready to help retrieve him from Skagos, as soon as the seas are truly passable. I suspect that may not be until spring. But I want to coordinate with you, Your Grace, so there's no misunderstanding about my intentions." Stannis gave a tight smile that did not reach his eyes. "No misunderstanding, Lord Manderly. If Rickon Stark is alive, I wish him restored to his seat. We can speak further once you've settled. Come, we'll find you quarters and share what food we have, meager though it is." With that, the merman of White Harbor was led inside, the courtyard alive with the hustle of unloading supplies. Soldiers cheered quietly, seeing crates of flour and salted meat. A glimmer of hope cut through the gloom. Perhaps Winterfell would last the winter after all. Perhaps unity was not just a dream. And if Rickon Stark could be found, perhaps the North could be fully healed. Shireen watched from an upper window, a little smile touching her lips. She caught a glimpse of Manderly's massive shape and the sledges behind him. Father said House Manderly was their greatest ally in the region, wealthy and cunning. She hoped it meant fewer men would starve. She returned to her seat by the window, reading about Skagos yet again, heart fluttering with possibility. In these silent halls, in the hush of falling snow, a single truth beat in her chest. Saving a child had saved a kingdom or begun to, and perhaps soon another child, Rickon Stark, might return to these ancient stones. Together, they might kindle a bright flame against the winter darkness. At the high table that evening, Stannis hosted a modest feast in Manderly's honor, though it was less a feast and more a slightly improved meal. Fresh bread from the new flour, salted fish from the Manderly crates, some turnip stew thickened with bits of pork. Ale was poured sparingly, but the men savored every drop. Lord Manderly, despite the meager portions, ate heartily, praising the king's hospitality. "The snows are thicker than my good waistline," he boomed, patting his belly. "Took us weeks to cut a path. But here we are." Stannis sat at the head of the table, Shireen at his right, Manderly at his left, with Davos, Tormund Mormont, and others arrayed. Torches flickered, reflecting off the battered stone walls. The conversation centered on the White Harbor blockade of ice, the rumored unrest at the wall, and the uncertain fate of Rickon Stark. Manderly sipped ale and addressed the table. "I have heard tales that young Rickon is guarded by a wildling woman, a spearwife who once served House Stark. She may be cunning, but Skagos is no place for a child. They say the Skagosi keep to their own ways, barely acknowledging kneelers from the mainland." Tormund Mormont grunted. I've heard that too. Cannibals, some say, but that might be an old wives' tale or half-truth. Either way, not a friendly place." Stannis fixed Manderly with a level gaze. "What do you propose, Lord Manderly?" The portly lord leaned forward. "A small, swift ship, manned by sailors I trust, once the ice clears enough for a crossing. The ship lands on Skagos covertly if possible. We search for the boy, retrieve him, and bring him back to White Harbor. Then we see him escorted to Winterfell to assume his rightful seat. However, if the boy is not there, or has passed from this life, then we'll know the rumor was false. But I must request your blessing, Your Grace, that none mistake this mission as an act of treason or defiance against your rule." Stannis folded his hands. "You have my blessing. I do not fear truth, Manderly. If Rickon Stark is alive, I'll hand Winterfell to him without bloodshed." A hush fell over the table. Some northern lords exchanged glances, surprised to hear such a frank statement. Manderly's face softened, respect glimmering in his eyes. "You are a rare king, then, one who values justice over personal gain." Stannis's voice was cool. "You mistake me if you think I do not also value victory. I merely will not claim what is not mine. My fight is with the false crowns in King's Landing. House Stark's seat belongs to House Stark. Manderley nodded, satisfied. Then he raised his cup. Well said. To the north and to Shireen Baratheon, the child who was saved. May the gods, old and new, bless her health. All eyes turned to Shireen. She flushed, lifting her own small cup of watered ale. The men around the table echoed Manderley's toast. For a moment, the great hall felt warm despite the winter outside. Shireen took a sip, a shy smile on her lips. Stannis dipped his head in faint acknowledgement. He caught Shireen's eye, and a current of unspoken understanding passed between them. She was here because he had spared her. That single act had changed everything. "Thank you," Shireen whispered. The feast continued in a subdued cheer. Men swapped stories, half-hearted jokes, and bits of news. Some teased Manderley about losing more weight on the road, which he took in good humor. Others marveled at how Shireen's presence seemed to lighten the king's normally severe demeanor. But soon enough, the ale ran low, and they dispersed to their cold chambers. Another day in a long winter. By the time Manderley had settled at Winterfell for a week, the storms worsened again, making any immediate journey to Skagos impossible. Rumors of the White Walkers multiplied. Travelers claimed that villages beyond the Gift were found empty, doors ajar, no living soul within. Stannis burned fresh logs day and night in the great hall's hearth, as though trying to keep the looming threat of ice at bay. Melisandre prayed more fervently, warning that the great other's power swelled in the darkest nights. Still, the realm endured. Winterfell stood, patched and strong, with the Stark banner overhead, hosting a southern king who had proven both merciless to traitors and merciful to the innocent. Each new day, men survived, forging a tenuous unity. And each day, Shireen learned more of the North's lore, carrying an ember of hope for the future. She sometimes prayed in the small sept with Celis, quietly. Other times, she wandered the godswood, the silent weirwood face staring at her. She wondered what those old gods thought of her father's presence here. Could they see how close she had come to the pyre? Could they see how that single spared life had drawn half the North to him? One night, unable to sleep, she stood alone on a balcony overlooking the courtyard. A light snow fell, flakes drifting like frozen tears. The moon painted the walls silver. She remembered Melisandre's cryptic words about two visions. In one, she stood at her father's side against the darkness. In another, she was lost to the cold. She clutched the railing, determined to defy that grim possibility. She was alive. She had a purpose, however small, in this swirling chaos of kings, wars, and ancient evils. She said a quiet prayer to whichever god might listen, that Rickon Stark was alive too, and that soon, perhaps, the North would know real peace. Below her, a handful of watchmen patrolled, stamping their feet to stay warm. The castle lights glimmered in pockets, hearths in the keep, torches at the gates, scattered lanterns near the stables. She sensed movement at one corner, a solitary figure in red, drifting through the snow toward the godswood. Melisandre, no doubt. Shireen watched the priestess vanish among the trees, leaving only a faint swirl of flakes in her wake. The child wondered if the Red Woman prayed for her now, prayed to keep her safe or prayed to reclaim her life's blood. The question remained, but Shireen pushed it aside. She returned to her room, took up a worn copy of The World of Ice and Fire, and began to read by candlelight. Tomorrow, more trials would come. Tomorrow, the North would still face hunger, war, and possibly an undead threat. But for this moment, Shireen had knowledge and a father who refused to sacrifice her. That was enough. Outside, the winter wind sighed across the battlements, weaving a lullaby of ice and endurance for Winterfell and all within its ancient stones. And beneath that hush, as the moon climbed higher, father and daughter found a fragile peace that might yet blaze bright when the final storms descended upon the realm.